Chapter 674. Jingyan, 2. Once Jingyan heard that Xian's breathing had evened out, indicating that she had fallen back asleep, she heaved a sigh of relief and quickly put on her nightgown. She even applied a fragrant perfume and patted some rouge on her cheeks. Jingyan checked her reflection by the wavering candle light and let out a satisfied smirk. It was all thanks to the accessories and makeup that Chu Lian had generously bestowed upon the maidservants that she could dress up so beautifully. There was the saying that all women were beauties under the lamplight. Jingyan felt that her current looks could be compared even to Chu Lian's. She twirled a lock of her hair and swayed out of her room, turning around to shut the door silently. She went over to the bedroom first to have a peek. When she saw that the two maidservants under her were properly guarding the door, and that Chu Lian was still deep in slumber, she left some orders for the maidservants before heading over to the kitchen. Jingyan took out the aphrodisiac soup she had brewed earlier and poured it into an exquisite porcelain bowl. She placed it carefully into a food box and made her way over to the study in the outer court. She had already overheard that He Changdi would be taking care of official business in the study tonight, and that there were only a few manservants on duty there. As long as He Changdi drank the soup she had brewed and she took the initiative, she trusted that things would fall into place. The more she thought about it, the more excited Jingyan got. Her body started trembling in anticipation. However, what she didn't know was that the moment she left Songtao Court, Chu Lian was called awake by someone. Chu Lian rubbed her eyes and sat up, looking over to Wenqing, who was standing beside her. Although her voice was a little husky from sleep, her tone remained strangely calm. Has she gone? Wenqing's expression was full of indignant anger. She nodded. Madam, this servant is going to tell master immediately. Chu Lian was more clear-headed after a while. She turned to Wenqing and shook her head. Follow her and watch what happens. Just report to me when everything is over. Wenqing gasped. Madam, that won't be good, right? Chu Lian let out a light chuckle. What? You don't have any confidence in your master? Wenqing hurriedly shook her head. She felt that her master would definitely kick Jingyan right out the moment she reached the study. Then all is well, isn't it? All right, I'm still sleepy. You go ahead. That said, Chu Lian laid right back down, pulled the thin blanket over her belly, and shut her almond-shaped eyes. Wenqing had no choice but to do as Chu Lian had ordered. When only Chu Lian was left in the bedroom, her eyes fluttered open. There was no trace of sleepiness in her eyes now, and they were bright and clear. Jingyan hadn't been a good character at all in the original novel. She had also died even earlier than Mingyan had. As for why Chu Lian had still kept her by her side, she had simply been giving her a chance to change for the better. After all, nothing had happened yet. However, she wasn't that naive. She had already taken some precautions against Jingyan. Wenqing had been watching her secretly. If she hadn't gone overboard today, Chu Lian was about to trust that she had turned over a new leaf. Unfortunately, she had still taken a step down the wrong path. Although she knew that He Changdi would definitely reject Jingyan, she still couldn't help the thread of uncertainty winding around her heart. She wasn't as calm and indifferent about this as she tried to appear to Wenqing. It was only because she cared about He Changdi that she worried that she might lose him. Chu Lian stared up at the canopy of the bed, biting her lip and waiting for more news. Since Jingyan was one of Chu Lian's 4 handmaids, she easily gained entrance to the courtyard where the main study was located. When she walked up to the final barrier, Jingyan struggled to hide the pleased smirk on her lips. Laiwe was standing at the entrance of the study. When he noticed Jingyan walking over with a box of food, he happily went up to welcome her. Miss Jingyan, why have you come at this hour? Jingyan smiled and bobbed towards Laiwe. It's my turn on duty over at Madam's. Madam ordered this servant to deliver this nourishing soup to master for supper before she slept. Laiwe found it strange. Chu Lian rarely sent supper over to He Changdi. Also, He Changdi usually spent most of his time with Chu Lian over the past month or so he would sleep early at night. It was very rare that he even had the chance to eat supper. However, Jingyan was one of Chu Lian's personal handmaids. Even if Laiwe was a little doubtful of the reason behind Jingyan's sudden visit, he still let her in. Then please try to be quiet when you enter, Miss Jingyan. Leave immediately once you set down the box. Master doesn't like to be disturbed while working. Jingyan nodded obediently and took out a finely embroidered purse from her sleeve for Liyue. Liyue had been working for Changdi for some time, and his looks weren't too bad. There were plenty of maidservants who tried to pass him gifts normally. As pretty and heavy as Jingyan's purse looked, he still rejected it politely. Truthfully speaking, Liyue was too used to seeing riches to want to take such a small gift. It couldn't even compare to a bowl of Yangzhou fried rice cooked by Xiyan. Jingyan awkwardly took back her purse and bobbed once again to Liyue before carefully tiptoeing into the study. There were official documents and secret letters covering Changdi's desk. He was currently sitting straight behind the desk, dressed in a black robe depicting a fearsome mountain tiger. His black hair was tied up in a jade crown, befitting his elegant features, and he was draped in a cool and outstanding aura. There was a slight furrow between his brows, and he was playing with the green jade ring on his left thumb, as if pondering something. Changdi's every gesture showed off the elegance of a noble gentleman. Jingyan's eyes lit up with sparkles. She did her best to suppress the pounding waves of excitement about to burst out from her heart, and called out with her head bowed, "Master." When Changdi's dark gaze alighted on Jingyan's figure, the furrow between his brows deepened. Jingyan held up the box of food in her hands nervously, but she tried her best to hide it and explain. "Master, this servant is here on Madam's orders to deliver some supper. This is what Madam instructed this servant earlier." Chapter 675. Causing Her Own Demise, 1. Changdi looked her over once before ordering, "Put it down and get out." Jingyan was startled by the abrupt command. She hadn't thought that Changdi would be so cold and indifferent towards her. His gaze hadn't even lingered even a second longer over her. Jingyan bit her lip and made a decision in her heart. She only had one chance. If she missed out on this one chance, then she would have to give up on her dream. She took a deep breath and put on the most seductive expression she could muster up. Ignoring Changdi's order to set down the box and leave, she sashayed up to Changdi and put the food box down at one corner of the table. Jingyan spoke in a soft voice, "Master, Madam is worried for your health, so Madam specially told me to watch Master drink the soup down." The cold aura that Changdi had kept under control suddenly burst out in full force. He had been considering the fact that Jingyan had been serving as Chu Lian's maidservant ever since she had married him, so he had given her some leeway. However, since she wanted to invite her own death, he wasn't going to show her any mercy. Jingyan hadn't noticed the subtle changes in Changdi. She was so nervous that her heart was about to leap out of her chest. She couldn't possibly have taken note of the expression on Changdi's slightly bowed head. Her slender hand moved to her waist. With a gentle tug, her thin nightgown came undone, revealing her long, snow-white legs and her full bosom. Jingyan gathered her courage and leaned over the table, revealing her exposed chest to Changdi's sight. Her voice wavered as she offered in a delicate and frail manner, Master, this servant will help you drink the soup." The rage in Changdi's chest reached its peak upon hearing Jingyan's shy words. He abruptly lifted his head. The frozen expression on his handsome face had finally changed, but it wasn't the change Jingyan had been hoping for. His handsome mien was slightly contorted into a malevolent expression, and his deep eyes were like ancient glaciers. Jingyan was scared stiff by that sinister look on Changdi. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she lost all strength and collapsed to the ground. By now, Jingyan had finally realized how stupid her decision had been. However, it was too late for regrets. Changdi didn't have any ounce of pity for a woman like this. A corner of his lips tugged upwards into a smirk. That smirk wasn't sympathetic at all, making him seem even more terrifying and cruel. In the next second, the disheveled and half-naked Jingyan was kicked right out of the study. She rolled and landed right by Leiyu's feet. "Liyue." Following that, Changdi's angry roar burst out from the study. "Once you've taken care of her, go and punish yourself." Leiyu's own expression turned overcast, and he glared fiercely at the unconscious Jingyan. He was extremely vexed inside. It wasn't until the 3-month mark had passed that the symptoms had slowly abated and her appetite had returned. Now Chu Lian could down 2 bowls of rice by herself at one go. Perhaps due to the scare from last month, Changdi couldn't seem to set his worries aside. He asked about her condition daily and whether the little one had made trouble for her. Chu Lian shook her head. After the first 3 months, the little bun seemed to have settled down. Other than a slight bump in her abdomen, she hardly felt pregnant by now, other than being just a little sleepier than usual. Chapter 676. Causing Her Own Demise, 2. He Changdi patted Chu Lian's back before pausing and asking, "How do you want to handle Jingyan?" Chu Lian's mind was wide awake by now. Now she thought back to what He Changdi had first said to her, and she finally understood his meaning. She tugged at He Changdi's collar unhappily. "You can handle it however you like. I don't want to see her again." He Changdi mulled over it. He didn't want her to have to take care of such matter even while she was pregnant. Furthermore, she was carrying their child, so she shouldn't see anything bloody. He Changdi sunk deeper into thought. "Shall I get another 2 maidservants for you?" Chu Lian shook her head. "No need. Let's wait until our child is born before we add any more servants to the household." There were already plenty of servants around her. 2 days ago, Princess Wei had even specially sent over a senior servant and some maidservants specializing in caring for pregnant noblewomen. He Changdi didn't push the issue and simply enjoyed holding her. He breathed in the faint fragrance emanating from her body and shut his eyes. Chu Lian played with the collar on his chest and asked in a soft voice, "Were you busy the whole night?" He Changdi made a tired groan in response. Chu Lian thought for a bit before moving back a little. Looking at the sky outside, the sun would likely rise in less than 2 hours. "Come here. Why don't you sleep for a while?" He Changdi had only been holding her at the edge of the bed. When he opened his eyes and saw that she had given up more than half of the bed for him, he smiled. "It looks like you're really getting more and more daring. Aren't you afraid that the momos will nag you?" Chu Lian blushed before glaring at him. "Are you going to sleep or not?" He Changdi moved his body and took up all the space she had offered. He didn't even take off any of his clothes, simply holding her loosely in his embrace. Since finding out about Chu Lian's pregnancy, the 2 senior servants had forbidden the couple to sleep on the same bed. He Changdi normally slept next to the bed on a chaise. It was now a rare chance for him to sleep together with his wife. He hadn't hugged Chu Lian to sleep for so long. As he breathed in her naturally sweet scent, he quickly drifted off into dreamland. Chu Lian shifted her position within his arms and lifted her chin to look at He Changdi's features, softened by sleep. She couldn't resist reaching out to stroke his skin. There were dark circles under his eyes, showing how he had worked the whole night. Although Chu Lian didn't really ask about what He Changdi was doing at court, from the first half of the novel that she had read, she could guess at some things. While things seemed calm in the capital for now, there was actually a storm brewing underneath. Ever since the Crown Prince had presented the fake phoenix to the Emperor, there had been more and more of his ugly news revealed. Finally, the corruption case in Chaozhou had been exposed. While the Crown Prince was still holding on to his position, he had already been grounded in the East Palace for close to 2 months. This grounding was basically equal to imprisonment. The officials on the Crown Prince's side had made their moves. Some of them had switched sides, and some of them had resigned. There were barely any supporters of the Crown Prince left. It was practically a fact that the Emperor had already taken away the title of Crown Prince from Second Prince. All that remained was the formalities. By now, the factions of 6th Prince and 4th Prince were already going against each other in secret. He Changdi had been working through the night likely due to a major incident in their faction. She didn't know much of politics in court and didn't have any subordinates who could be of use, so she couldn't help him directly. The only way she could contribute was likely through money. The first batch of tea that she had prepared in early spring had already been sent to Dijufeng. She would likely get the results from that tea soon. Deep in her thoughts, Chu Lian didn't notice the passing of time. In the blink of an eye, it was time for He Changdi to head out to court. Wenqing called out from outside to remind them of the time. Before Chu Lian could wake He Changdi, he had already opened his eyes. "Are you still sleepy?" Chu Lian rubbed his slightly prickly chin and placed a kiss on it with a mischievous smile. The sight of her rosy cheeks riled up the desire in He Changdi's heart. He returned the kiss with force, but on her lips. Only when he had had his fill did he stop and try to calm the fires burning in his body. "Well, get up now, otherwise I won't make it in time for court. You can sleep a little longer. When I return, let's go to the old residence together." Actually, Chu Lian wasn't that sleepy either. She had already slept more than enough in the day and earlier at night. Even if she had only laid down with her eyes open for 2 hours, she still felt rather energetic. She got up and helped He Changdi to find his court robes. She then personally instructed Xian to prepare breakfast before accompanying He Changdi for the meal. Chu Lian sent him off at the gates. Chu Lian looked over the servants following after He Changdi and noticed that Lai Yue wasn't there. She found it strange and remarked on it. "Where's Lai Yue? Has he gone somewhere to skive off?" Wenqing chuckled awkwardly. "He did something wrong yesterday, and he's been punished by Master. He's currently lying in bed." Chu Lian was surprised. "He was beaten?" Wenqing nodded and held out 2 fingers, 20 strikes of the rod. Chu Lian's mouth twitched. She had a rough guess at why Lai Yue had been punished. She glanced at Wenqing and noticed the concerned expression on her face, so she ordered, "Go and prepare some ointment and snacks. Visit him on my behalf. He's been a loyal servant of your master for so long after all, and it wasn't entirely his fault what happened last night." Chapter 677. Matriarchy's Good Intentions. 1. A spark of joy flashed across Wenqing's eyes. She bobbed towards Chu Lian and left to look for some ointment. He Changdi had already sent a messenger out to the old residence with the good news this morning when he left the estate. When it was almost lunchtime, Countess Jingon actually came over personally with a group of servants. Chu Lian hurriedly went out to welcome her. Once she escorted her in all the way to Songtao Court, Countess Jingon looked her up and down with a beaming smile. "I can't tell that you're pregnant at all. You haven't put on any weight." Chu Lian led the countess over to a chair. "Mother, I'm eating 2 bowls of rice at each meal. I'm already trying my best." Countess Jingon was in a good mood after seeing that her daughter-in-law looked bright and healthy. "Eat whatever you want. If you don't have it around, then send Sanling out to get it. You can't let yourself suffer." Chu Lian thought to herself, Sanling might not even be able to find what she wanted to eat. The Great Wu didn't have any of the snacks from the modern world. "I'll listen to you, Mother." "Really? Why did the 2 of you wait until now to tell us the news? If I had known earlier, I would have moved over to take care of you. You're all alone here, and we can't be too careless with your first pregnancy." Countess Jingon was genuinely happy for her son and daughter-in-law. She couldn't count on her eldest and second sons, so she was hoping that He Changdi and Chu Lian could have a child as soon as possible. Chu Lian didn't hide the truth from her. "Mother, we don't need you to work so hard to take care of us. We have some senior servants around. Also, my pregnancy wasn't stable before, so we didn't mention it to you." Countess Jingon was managing the Jingon estate now, so she couldn't just leave and come over here to stay. There was also the matriarch still back in the old residence, so she couldn't really do as she said to look after Chu Lian. The countess was startled upon hearing that the baby had almost been lost. "Have you asked an imperial physician to check? How is it now?" Chu Lian smiled. "There's no problems at all now. We have Uncle Miao here too, so we don't need any imperial physicians." If she had really requested for an imperial physician over to check her health, then she wouldn't have been able to hide her pregnancy. Hearing so, Countess Jingon heaved a sigh of relief. She started talking to Chu Lian with sincerity and passion. "You absolutely have to take good care of your health during this pregnancy. If there's an emergency, and unless there's no other choice, I would rather that you give up the child than to damage your body permanently. Don't follow down my path. The 2 of you are still young. If you nurse your body well, there will still be time to get pregnant again." This was what Countess Jingon truly felt from the bottom of her heart. Back then, she had ignored her weak health to give birth to children, causing her to fall seriously ill and suffer for decades. Of course, Countess Jingon didn't blame any of her 3 sons. They were all her flesh and blood, so there was no such thing as resentment or hate for them. She simply wanted to let her daughter-in-law know how important it was for her body to be healthy. Chu Lian was touched by the countess. It hadn't been easy for her mother-in-law to speak such words to her. "Mother, don't worry, I'm perfectly healthy now. Then I'll rest assured about your health. Come, let me tell you some things you have to take note of during your pregnancy." While Chu Lian had already heard similar pointers from the senior servants, she still patiently listened to all of what Countess Jingon had to say and made mental notes in her heart. Xian steeped the newly made batch of tea for Countess Jingon, while Chu Lian only had honey water. Countess Jingon sipped at the tea to wet her throat before dismissing the maidservants around them and pulling Chu Lian closer to ask some intimate questions. A corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched, and she shook her head with a blush. Lianer, there are some things that Mother just has to tell you. You can't spoil your man at this time. Don't be so muddle-headed as other women and find some bed servant for your husband while you're inconvenienced. Our house doesn't follow such customs anyway. Chu Lian found it funny and spoke honestly, Mother. I'm not that generous. I think you've overestimated me. It's already been a tough month for me with this pregnancy. I'm already doing pretty good not torturing my husband. I wouldn't be so silly as to give him to some other woman. Countess Jingon stroked her head, satisfied with her answer. It's good as long as you understand. However, we can't be too harsh with our husbands at times too. While Countess Jingon wasn't the brightest with managing the household, she did have a hand with managing her husband. Otherwise, how could a fearsome man like her father-in-law be so enamored with his one wife? Once I heard that you were pregnant, I prepared plenty of things for you. I came a little rushed today, so we'll send them back with you after you come over to visit the old residence. Chu Lian didn't reject the offer and simply smiled in agreement. The Jingon estate. Once the third branch had moved out, the atmosphere here had cooled down significantly, especially in the matriarch's Qingxi Hall. He Erlang rarely returned to the estate, and Dalong was out from early morning to night. Every day, only Countess Jingon would come over to greet the matriarch with little N and little Lin in tow. Matriarch, he wasn't very close to her two great-granddaughters. If not for Count Jingon rejecting the idea, she would have gone to the rural estate to live with He Ying and her daughter. The matriarch's vision and hearing were both getting worse, while there was more and more white spreading in her hair. Each day, she woke up with aches and pains in her old body. It was no wonder that Count Jingon wouldn't let his aging mother go off to the rural estate. When He Changdi and his wife moved out of the estate, the matriarch felt frustrated with her remaining anger. Having a great-grandson had always been matriarchy's dearest wish. Now that they had suddenly received the news of Chu Lian's pregnancy, as much as the enmity between the matriarch and Chu Lian hadn't been resolved, the old woman still viewed Chu Lian in a better light. Chapter 678. Matriarchy's Good Intentions 2. Chu Lian was only 3 months pregnant, so counting back the days, it had happened only after they had returned to the capital. It was definitely their He family's child and not some wild bastard. Once she got the news, the matriarch went into the ancestral hall to offer up incense with the help of senior servant Lu. Although she was already a bag of old bones, she insisted on kneeling for 2 whole hours, begging for Chu Lian's first child to be a boy. Even senior servant Lu couldn't move her from her prayers. When she returned from the ancestral hall, matriarchy started preparing things for her unborn great-grandson. Senior servant Lu noticed that the old matriarch wouldn't sit still and tried to coax her. Matriarch, you don't have to be so rushed. There's still another 6 months to go. Furthermore, we don't know if it'll be a little girl or boy. If you prepare the wrong items, then it will go to waste. The matriarch's expression turned fierce upon hearing such words from senior servant Lu. What nonsense are you speaking? Of course it's going to be a little boy. Senior servant Zhou, follow my instructions and prepare all the items for boys. Senior servant Lu had no choice but to follow along with what matriarchy wanted. While the servants were busying themselves, Mu Xiang stood still in shock like a statue. She ran back to her own room in a panic and locked the door. Once the door was shut, she could no longer hide the resentful and sinister expression on her face. From an obedient maidservant, she changed into a demon who had just crawled up from hell. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be. She leaned bonelessly against the door, sliding down into a squat. She grabbed at her hair, her eyes staring wildly into space, as if she couldn't accept the news she had just heard. In her past life, she hadn't had any children since she hadn't consummated her marriage with He Changdi. After she had gotten together with Xiao Bojian, although the two of them had gone to bed together many times, she hadn't gotten pregnant. She had always thought that it was her body that wasn't fertile, and she had always held some regret. When she opened her eyes and realized that she had been reincarnated into one of Matriarchy's maidservants, she had first felt cold, hard fear. Later on, that had been mixed with a thread of elatement, as this body was perfectly healthy. In the future, when she got Changdi back again, she could give birth to their children. Furthermore, the lack of any good news from the current Chulian and Changdi after they had been married for so long had proven her guess from her past life. However, how had this happened? Wasn't her old body supposed to be infertile? How had that imposter gotten pregnant with Changdi's child? How could it be? She was the only one in the world who could bear children for Changdi. The more Mu Xiang thought about it, the angrier she was. Slowly, that anger was mixed with depression. She wanted to rush over to Chu Lian right now and tear her into pieces. Why? How? That body was hers. She was the one who was supposed to marry Changdi. How could that monstrous imposter use her body and take her husband and live so happily? In her extreme rage, Mu Xiang destroyed everything she could move in her room. When she was done, she laid panting over the desk, her eyes bitterly cold as she looked at the bits and pieces of the broken things on the floor. She looked like a viper eyeing her prey and wanting it dead. That monster had stolen away her body. She wasn't going to let it go so easily. When Changdi returned in the evening, Chu Lian had already ordered the servants to prepare everything. Countess Jinggan and Chu Lian sat in the same carriage, while Changdi rode his horse alongside them and the guards all the way back to the old residence. They had already made a promise with the rest of the family that they would meet at the Jinggan estate tonight. Even Changjue had returned early. Once they got to the Jinggan estate, Chu Lian and Changdi bowed in greeting to Matriarch He and Count Jinggan, before taking their seats at the large round table in the center of the parlor. This intimate family banquet was bathed in a joyous and harmonious atmosphere. Even Matriarch He didn't make any sour comments. When they were done, the family moved to the parlor of Qingxi Hall to have tea and chat. Now that Chu Lian was pregnant, Matriarch He's mood seemed to be much better. Changdi hadn't returned to the old residence in some time as well, so Matriarch He pulled him alongside her to catch up. Seeing that Changdi had become much thinner, the matriarch's heart ached for her youngest grandson. Look at you. Why don't you know how to take care of yourself outside? You've become so thin. Chu Lian stiffened up a little, but she didn't say anything. While Matriarch He might not have meant anything by her words, it didn't sound like that to the others. It sounded like the matriarch was blaming her granddaughter-in-law for not taking good care of her husband and allowing him to get so thin from overworking. Changdi's cool and handsome face didn't change at all. When he spoke, it was in his usual low tones. Grandmother, you must be mistaken. I haven't lost weight at all. Since it was rare that Changdi would return to visit them, the matriarch didn't contest his words. All right, you haven't gotten thinner at all. Countess Jinggan followed up to smooth out the awkwardness in the air. It looks like Sanlang has gotten even more muscular than before. Mother, you don't have to worry at all. The family continued chatting happily. Count Jinggan didn't say much, but his gaze was full of satisfaction and affection when looking at his youngest son and daughter-in-law. Just as the family was enjoying the peaceful atmosphere, the matriarch suddenly spoke up. Sanlang's wife, since you've already moved out, then so be it. I can't stop you anyway. In the past, it didn't matter much that it was only the two of you in your estate, but things are different now. Sanlang's wife is pregnant. We can't be careless with this. I'm too old and I can't walk well now, so I can't move over to your estate. However, I can't rest easy with the two of you so far away. I thought over this for some time, and I've decided to send Mu Xiang back with you. She can serve Sanlang's wife and report her condition to me. We'll feel more reassured this way. Chapter 679. Mu Xiang enters the estate. 1. Everyone was stunned by the sudden decision from Matriarch He. Let Mu Xiang go to the Anyuan estate to take care of Chu Lian? Mu Xiang was Matriarch He's most trusted handmaid. The announcement set everyone to thinking as they tried to discern how much sincerity was in Matriarch He's gesture. However, when they thought carefully about it, it seemed like there was no reason for Matriarch He to make things difficult for Chu Lian. After all, the matriarch had been waiting for this unborn child for very long. While she had some conflict with Chu Lian previously, The child was innocent. The matriarch might be muddle-headed at times, but not to the degree of harming a child. Mu Xiang was a family servant. Her parents had passed away when she was a child, leaving her behind, so she had started serving the matriarch at an early age. Even senior servant Liu had praised her work before. Anyone with eyes in the entire Jinggan estate could see her character for themselves. Even the harshest senior servant would likely recommend Mu Xiang for any work. Furthermore, her looks were very average and didn't stand out at all. Any one of Chu Lian's handmaids had her beat in the looks department. Matriarchy's intention to send Mu Xiang over to Chu Lian's place was really likely only out of concern for her unborn great-grandson. Chu Lian had also thought of all these. It wouldn't be good to reject the matriarch in front of so many people too. If there was really something wrong with Mu Xiang, then she could have her servants keep an eye over her in the Anyuan estate. Countess Jinggan subtly winked at Chu Lian, indicating that Chu Lian should agree to the matriarch's request. Chu Lian turned her head slightly to gauge He Changda's reaction. His eyes narrowed slightly in response. Since he hadn't spoken up to reject the offer, Chu Lian knew what she should do next. She stood up and bobbed towards the matriarch. Then granddaughter-in-law shall accept grandmother's kind offer. Please don't worry, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law will treat Mu Xiang like any other servant in the Anyuan estate. The matriarch nodded in satisfaction. By the time the couple were ready to leave, Mu Xiang had already packed her bags and was following behind Chu Lian. On the way back to the estate, Mu Xiang sat in the same carriage as Wanlan. Mu Xiang had a good reputation amongst the servants in the Jinggan estate, and she had grown up by matriarchy's side. Everyone treated her as a highly ranked servant. After Wanlan had been transferred to Chu Lian's side, she and her sister Wenqing had occasionally interacted with Mu Xiang. Mu Xiang was well-mannered and treated everyone generously. She was also a warm and magnanimous person. Others might even think that she was a young lady from one of the smaller noble houses. Wenqing and Wanlan both had good impressions of Mu Xiang. Chapter 680. Mu Xiang enters the estate. 2. Chu Lian quickly came back with a small, exquisite mahogany box. She sat down by He Changda's side and pushed the box to him. There, that's for you. He Changda's voice was low and magnetic as he asked with a little smile, What is it? Chu Lian passed him the tiny silver key that she kept on her at all times. Won't you know once you open it? Expectation built up in He Changda's heart unconsciously. He took the silver key and made quick work of the lock. With a clack, the box sprung open. There was a contract and a square personal seal. Although He Changda didn't interfere with Chu Lian's businesses and he never investigated her properties, he still knew a little about what his wife did. His servants were still right by her side after all. A personal seal from Tonghui? Tonghui Bank was a bank opened by one of the rich Shandong nobility. Although it wasn't as big as the government-controlled Longhui Bank, it was a private bank, so there were all sorts of powers backing it. It was a mix of crooks and honest folk. Those who didn't want to reveal their identity would use Tonghui Bank. Tonghui Bank would issue a type of personal seal specially for important clients. As long as they brought the stamp to a branch of Tonghui Bank, they would immediately be able to draw cash. There were very few of these seals in circulation, less than 100 according to rumors. Tonghui Bank was older than the Great Wu Dynasty, so it could be imagined how valuable a personal seal from Tonghui Bank was. This was also a direct reflection of how profitable Chu Lian's northern market was. Chu Lian nodded without any change in expression. It's mine. I'm giving it to you to use. Aren't you lacking in funds? He Changda's gaze fell upon his beautiful wife. He sighed and stroked her smooth cheek. My silly Lianer, don't you know what this seal represents? And you're giving it to me just like that? Chu Lian puffed up her cheeks and rolled her eyes. What else could it represent? It's just money. What can I do with all that money anyway? You'll put it to better use. Our Great Wu is large but lacking in material goods, so it's easy to earn money. Anyway, it's not like there's a limit to how much I can earn. I'm not a dragon that needs to hoard gold either. Chu Lian thought differently from most noble ladies because she was a modern person at heart. Most noble madams would simply store and save up their money once they earned it and feel content looking at the mountain of gold at home. What they didn't know was that money had to be spent in order to generate wealth. The amount of money that Chu Lian had was just a number anyway. Using it where needed and getting things done was more important. She had only opened up the market in the north on a lark, for the citizens of Liangzhou and giving the poor barbarian people another source of income. Chapter 681. Poisoned. 1. After another half-month, it was finally time for He Changqi's concubine, Miaozhen, to give birth. Miaozhen went through labor for a whole day and night before her child was finally born. However, it was just a girl. This made the matriarch very disappointed. After this illegitimate daughter of the main branch was born, the matriarch never even asked after them once. Since Miaozhen's pregnancy hadn't been smooth sailing and she had almost lost her child once, she passed away due to losing too much blood right after the birth. The newborn girl was weak from birth, and she lost her mother too early. He Changqi was a busy man, so it was Countess Jinggan who had to step up to take care of the child. When Chu Lian heard the news, she gave out a sigh and subconsciously rubbed her own belly. A motherless child was most pitiful. Furthermore, that child was only a low-ranking, illegitimate daughter. If Countess Jinggan took her under her protection, all would be well. However, if her mother-in-law didn't have the energy to take care of that child, then that child would never have a good life. Chu Lian called over senior servant Gue and told her to prepare some gifts for Countess Jinggan in order to celebrate the newly born life. Mu Xiang was on duty at the side. When she saw Chu Lian acting this way, she felt contempt. She was jealous to the point of madness within. She cursed the freak who had taken over her body to die an early death. However, she hid her disdain well. Even Chu Lian hadn't seen any inklings of anything suspicious to do with Mu Xiang after half a month. Wenqing brought in a pot of nourishing soup and placed the tray on the desk. She scooped some soup into a bowl and placed it in front of Chu Lian before asking, "Madam, are we still going to Prince Wei's estate in the afternoon?" Chu Lian nodded while enjoying her soup. "Of course, tell the steward to prepare the carriages and the guards. They'll go right over after the meal." Royal Princess Duanjia had come over to visit Chu Lian 2 days ago. She had mentioned that Princess Wei had been feeling giddy and faint recently, and that the imperial physicians hadn't been able to tell what was wrong. Chu Lian had been startled by this news, and she had promised Royal Princess Duanjia that she would bring great Dr. Miao over to check on Princess Wei. When they were done with lunch, Chu Lian and great Dr. Miao sat on separate carriages and headed to Prince Wei's estate under the protection of a group of guards. Prince Wei's estate wasn't too far from the Anyuan estate. It only took about 15 minutes by carriage. Since she had already made an appointment with Royal Princess Duanjia, when they reached the gates of the estate, there was a steward already waiting for them. He welcomed them in and let them ride in without disembarking from the carriages. Senior servant Lan personally ushered Chu Lian and great Dr. Miao into the inner court, where Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia were already waiting. The moment Chu Lian entered, she could see how pale Princess Wei looked. She quickly stepped forward to make her bob, but Royal Princess Duanjia immediately pulled her up and rolled her eyes at Chu Lian. "Chu Lu, why are you still acting so courteous with us? Come and sit." A smile blossomed on Princess Wei's face at the sight of Chu Lian. She held Chu Lian's soft little hand and pulled her down to sit next to her. She looked her up and down for a long moment before frowning. "Why haven't you put on any weight after getting pregnant?" Chu Lian hurriedly shook her head. "Of course I have." She leaned closer in and made a pained expression as she explained. "My legs and arms have gotten much thicker. I'm actually troubled over how fat I've gotten. If my stomach gets any bigger, it'll feel like a ball." Princess Wei poked her in the middle of her shiny forehead and glared at her. "You silly girl. What nonsense are you saying? I have a few recipes that are good for pregnant women. They'll have senior servant Lan write them down for you later." "Then I'll have to thank your highness." Princess Wei couldn't resist pinching her pink cheeks. Following that, Chu Lian helped Princess Wei into a side room so that great Dr. Miao could check her pulse. Hidden behind a screen, the emperor looked at Chu Lian with loving eyes. The Yi Sun of his memories had been around Chu Lian's age. However, Yi Sun had been slightly taller and more curvy than Chu Lian was now. Chu Lian had only resembled her mother partly before when she was thinner. Now that she had put on a little weight from the pregnancy, she looked more and more like Yi Sun. The emperor was stunned at first sight, and he almost thought that Yi Sun had come back to life. Unknowingly, the emperor's eyes became wet with tears as the memories that he had almost forgotten were awakened by the sight. Thinking back to the wonderful times he had spent with Yi Sun and how the two had been forced apart, as well as how Yi Sun had been forced to marry someone else while bearing his child, his heart was set aflame. His face turned purple, and he actually fainted right over. Prince Wei, who had been accompanying his brother, was shocked out of his wits. He managed to catch the emperor with quick reflexes. Otherwise, the emperor would likely have knocked his brains out on the ground. Prince Wei's expression turned, and he called out quietly to his brother, Brother, please wake up." Unfortunately, the unconscious emperor didn't react to his brother's voice. A shadow fell over Prince Wei's expression, and he quickly ordered the secret guards to bring the emperor to a room at the side. He then passed his own personal token to another secret guard and ordered him to bring the imperial physicians over discreetly. On the other side, Great Dr. Miao had just finished taking Princess Wei's pulse and was explaining his diagnosis to her. "There's no need to worry, Your Highness. These are just some symptoms of weakness. They'll prescribe some medicine for you to treat the weakness in your body. Your Highness should recover completely after a few months." Chu Lian visibly relaxed upon hearing the doctor's diagnosis. Meanwhile, there was a subtle hint of awkwardness on Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia's faces. Actually, they had already known that Princess Wei wasn't really ill, so they had exaggerated the symptoms a little, so they had an excuse to invite her over to their estate. He Changdi had been very overprotective of her. If not for the pregnancy having passed 3 months, they might not even have been able to get her out of her estate. Thus, they had used the excuse of Princess Wei's poor health to invite the pregnant Chu Lian out, as well as to satisfy the request that the emperor had made. Princess Wei had already found out the true reason behind this request from Prince Wei, so she now had an extra degree of closeness and love towards Chu Lian. The princess treated Chu Lian as if she were really her daughter now. Chapter 682. Poisoned 2. Your Highness, you'll have to eat your medicine regularly. They'll tell Senior Servant Lan what to do. Chu Lian didn't know of the underlying reasons for her visit. She was genuinely concerned for Princess Wei's health. Great Dr. Miao stroked his long, white beard with a spark of understanding in his eyes. His decades of experience meant that he could see through certain things. Although he had realized what was going on the moment he read Princess Wei's pulse, the sharp Great Dr. Miao didn't expose their excuse and simply followed along with what Princess Wei wanted. "Lianer, don't worry. You still have to worry about your own health first. With that little one in your belly, have the symptoms gotten better this month?" Chu Lian smiled and nodded. "I can eat whatever I want now without any nausea." Princess Wei returned the smile and stroked her head. While the atmosphere in the room was warm, Senior Servant Lan suddenly rushed into the room with a terrible expression. Princess Wei frowned at the sight. "What's wrong? Why are you in such a hurry?" Senior Servant Lan glanced at Chu Lian, then Royal Princess Duanjia. In the end, she could only lean close to Princess Wei and whisper something into her ear. "What?" The originally kind expression on Princess Wei's face fell away, and absolute shock replaced it in an instant. The fact that she hadn't been able to conceal the change spoke to the gravity of the news. It was very rare that Princess Wei would act this way. Even Royal Princess Duanjia had never seen her mother lose her composure like this before. Royal Princess Duanjia asked urgently, "Mother, what's wrong?" Chu Lian stood up along with Royal Princess Duanjia. She pressed her lips without speaking and looked seriously at Princess Wei. With a subtle nudge from Senior Servant Lan, Princess Wei suddenly came back to her senses. She abruptly looked towards Great Dr. Miao, who was sitting at one side. "Doctor, I have a request that I hope you might accept." Princess Wei spoke very humbly. She didn't even refer to her status while speaking. Great Dr. Miao was first startled for a moment, before he replied, "If your Highness has some request, please feel free to speak. If it is within my means to help, I won't stand by idly." While Great Dr. Miao did have some arrogance that came with his age, he wasn't stupid. He knew of Princess Wei's status. Someone who could make her this worried enough to humble herself, was likely someone of equally high status. Although he didn't care about fame, He knew that there were some people he couldn't afford to offend if he wanted to continue living peacefully. Princess Wei just so happened to be one of those. Furthermore, it would likely be in line with his strengths, so there shouldn't be much difficulty in her request. Princess Wei was an upright character and she wouldn't make unreasonable demands. Soon, the princess personally led Great Dr. Miao to a room that was under heavy guard. Chu Lian was left under the care of Royal Princess Duanjia, and even senior servant Lan wasn't allowed to follow them. Within the heavily guarded room, Prince and Princess Wei stood by the bedside while two men stood not too far away. One of them was a clean-shaven man who looked to be in his 50s, while the other man was much younger. Great Dr. Miao only managed to glance at them before a chill ran down his spine. His gaze moved to the middle-aged man in steel-gray robes lying on the bed. The doctor suppressed the turbulent emotions in his heart by shutting his eyes and letting his mind calm down. He was invited to sit by the bed by Prince Wei. He didn't ask any questions and simply started taking the pulse of the middle-aged man according to Prince Wei's instructions. After 15 minutes or so had passed, Great Dr. Miao was done with his diagnosis. He looked back at the middle-aged man on the bed before looking up at Prince Wei. While time has left its mark on the mysterious man's face, it was clear that Prince Wei and the man were closely related. The two of them had very similar features. Great Dr. Miao was deliberating on what to say. His brow was already furrowed from tension. After mulling it over, he decided to tell the truth. "Your Highness, would it be possible to speak elsewhere?" Prince Wei was slightly surprised. He hadn't thought that the doctor would make such a request. He looked over the other people present in the room with caution. After a few seconds of thought, he agreed to Great Dr. Miao's request. "Doctor, please follow this prince this way." The two of them entered a quieter room. Prince Wei set his personal bodyguards at the entrance, so no one would dare to approach. Great Dr. Miao took a deep breath before speaking resolutely. "The patient has been poisoned." Even Prince Wei couldn't maintain his composure at this point. His eyes were wide with disbelief. "What did you say? He's been poisoned? How could that be possible?" His brother was the ruler of the land under heaven, the regent of their kingdom. There were many talents gathered under his court. How could he possibly be poisoned? Since Great Dr. Miao had decided to speak the truth, he had also considered Prince Wei's emotional outburst. He first waited for Prince Wei to calm down before explaining everything to him. "It's a slow-acting poison. This old doctor can't tell which poison it is until further examination. However, this old doctor can confirm that it isn't a common poison and that it hasn't spread throughout the patient's body yet. There is still a chance for treatment at this point. If treatment is delayed any longer, the patient will be beyond saving." Prince Wei had already been through great turmoil in his life. During the fight for the throne, where they had battled against their brothers, he and the emperor had carved out a bloody road for themselves. As grave as it was, could any other matter compare to the perilous situation they had been in back then? He quickly calmed down. "How confident are you that you will be able to treat the patient?" Great Dr. Miao was silent in thought for a moment before he lifted 7 fingers. 70%? With the right ingredients, it could be as high as 80%. Chapter 683, Businesses 1. Don't worry, Doctor. The ingredients aren't a problem. This prince will be able to gather whatever you need in the shortest possible time. Great Dr. Miao tactfully avoided any other questioning and focused on writing the prescription. In the evening, the emperor finally woke from his coma. Great Dr. Miao had been watching over him all this time. He heaved a sigh of relief and wiped at the cold sweat on his forehead. Since his job was done, he kept the silver acupuncture needles he had been using and bowed to Prince Wei before following Eunuch Wei out of the room, taking his medicinal case along. Chu Lian had stayed in Prince Wei's estate until it turned dark, so He Changdi came looking for her. The couple had their dinner at the estate before returning to their own home. Since Chu Lian was pregnant, He Changdi accompanied her in the carriage instead of riding his horse. Within the spacious carriage, He Sanling wrapped his wife in his arms and set his chin on the top of her head. One arm was placed at her waist, while his other hand was linked with hers. His low, magnetic voice resounded from the top of Chu Lian's head, "Lianer, How was Her Highness? While she had been with Princess Wei, Chu Lian had been worried for the prince's health. However, now that they had left Prince Wei's estate, she could feel that something wasn't quite right. She had spent more time with Great Dr. Miao, so she understood his personality well. From what he had said earlier, there was likely nothing wrong with Princess Wei's health, and the princess herself knew that as well. Since Princess Wei was perfectly healthy, why had she specially invited her over? Also, who had Great Dr. Miao gone to see in the afternoon? Senior Servant Lan wasn't any normal servant. Someone who could make her that anxious was likely very high-ranking. Chu Lian prodded at He Changdi and pulled away slightly from his embrace. She looked up at him with her lovely eyes, which contained an intelligent glint. She clutched He Changdi's robe with one hand and shook her head before asking, "Hubby, do you know who was ill at Prince Wei's estate today?" He Changdi had some men under his command. Some of them were from Prince Jin, and some of them were the Jingan estate's private soldiers, so he received news very quickly. He Sanling frowned. "I don't." The elder royal prince wasn't around, and the younger royal prince has always been healthy. Only Princess Wei has ever had any issues with her health. Since Princess Wei was fine, then who was it that Great Dr. Miao had seen? Chu Lian explained everything that had happened at the estate this afternoon to He Changdi. While deep in thought, He Changdi moved his arms to shift his wife into a more comfortable position. After some time, he spoke up, "Lianer, do you think it's the person above Prince Wei?" As He Sanlang was speaking, there was a glint in his eyes. Chu Lian was startled by this guess. She pondered it over in her mind and realized that it made sense. Why would His Majesty be at Prince Wei's estate at this time? I heard Royal Princess mention that His Majesty doesn't go incognito often. He Changdi bent down to kiss his wife's soft cheek before pressing her head into his chest. There were some things that he wasn't certain of, so he hadn't told them to Chu Lian yet. The Emperor's recent actions, especially those directed at him, were likely related to Chu Lian. It might be a coincidence. "Lianer, don't exert yourself too much thinking about these matters. When Uncle Miao returns, we'll go have a chat with him." Chu Lian didn't like thinking about politics and figuring out what the Emperor's intentions were. Furthermore, she had gotten lazier after becoming pregnant. She leaned back comfortably against He Changdi's chest and shut her eyes, feeling a little fatigued. He Sanling stroked her smooth hair. "I've already prepared something for Muxiang. Even if we've already taken enough precautions, you have to be careful. Don't give her any chances to attack." The day that Muxiang tried anything would become her very last day on this earth. While He Changdi was a loving and caring husband in front of Chu Lian, he was a grim devil to everyone else. After experiencing the tragedy of his past life, and from the start of his current life, he could still be considered a good person. Now that he had gone through the army and returned to the capital only to join in the dirty politics going on in court, there was more blood staining his hands. The fighting in the Emperor's court had always been 100 times more cruel than any spat in the inner courts. Chu Lian nodded sleepily, ensconced in the warmth of He Changdi's arms. He Changdi could sense his wife's breathing slowing down, so he hugged her more tightly. Right now, it wasn't just his beloved wife he was holding his arms, but also their very first unborn child. The little body he was hugging right now represented his entire world. Unknowingly, the ice on He Changdi's face melted away, leaving only a tiny, warm smile on his lips. The next day, Great Dr. Miao was sent back to the Anyuan estate. He Changdi personally went to visit Great Dr. Miao. After their chat, He Changdi had basically confirmed his suspicion that Great Dr. Miao's patient in Prince Wei's estate had been the Emperor himself. Great Dr. Miao had already decided to retire and spend the rest of his days in the Anyuan estate. He had saved Countess Jingan's life, and he had already become like a senior family member to He Changdi and Chu Lian, so they were on the same boat. Great Dr. Miao was also a smart one. He wouldn't hide anything from He Changdi and Chu Lian. With that piece of news, He Changdi went straight to Prince Jin's estate. Time passed in a flash. Another 2 months had gone in the blink of an eye. Although it was already August and autumn had arrived, the weather was still rather hot, especially for a pregnant woman with a growing belly. Chu Lian was now 6 months pregnant, so her belly had blown up. Right now, even if she wore the loosest dress she had, she wouldn't be able to hide the swell of her belly. Although she was now eating for two, other than the size of her abdomen, there weren't many physical changes. Her face didn't swell up at all. However, the pregnancy hormones had given her the natural glow that most pregnant women got. She became even more beautiful than before. Royal Princess Duanjia came to visit Chu Lian often and would comment enviously on how Chu Lian didn't look pregnant at all other than her belly. Most women would become plumper while pregnant. Some might even grow spots on their faces. They might not even be able to clean up properly or dress up as before, so their looks would drop a grade or two during their pregnancies. However, in contrary to all that, Chu Lian's face had undergone a transformation. She had lost all the baby fat on her face and turned into a stunning and ravishing beauty. Chapter 684, Businesses. 2 in the afternoon, Chu Lian was sitting in a pavilion by a lotus pond in their garden. There were quite a few different confections placed on the table. There were glutinous rice cakes, yam and jujube cakes, 4 joys dumplings, and cloud cakes. There was also a cup of fragrant jasmine flower tea next to the confections. Chu Lian leaned against the railing of the pavilion and listened to Manager Qin and Zhou Wen's reports on the northern market, as well as Di Jufeng restaurant. All that Chu Lian did for her business was to check the account books once a month. Everything else was left to the 2 managers to handle. Madam, the population of Liangzhou has already increased a few times over thanks to the northern market. More than half of the simple courtyards we built at the perimeter of Liangzhou City have been rented out. There are still a few more courtyards that are more finely decorated. Should we rent those out as well? The original Liangzhou City had been like a dead town. The citizens hadn't even outnumbered the soldiers stationed there. This had also caused the senior official seat of Liangzhou to remain empty ever since the last one had been sacked. Chu Lian had built more than 10 simple markets at the boundaries of Liangzhou at the start, attracting the barbarians and Tuhan commoners. They had used barter to trade goods at first. A jar of salted vegetables could be exchanged for some livestock, including cows, horses, or goats. It didn't even matter if they transported the livestock as live animals or after processing them into meat and skins. They would reap incredible profits by shipping them to Sioux City. Later on, as the markets grew bigger and bigger, the barbarians and Tuhuns were no longer so stupid as to continue trading at that low price. While the price of material goods had increased, due to the restrictions of the geography in Liangzhou, there was still a huge difference in price from the other cities that they could profit from. Merchants pursued opportunities. Sioux City was close to Qianshan Lake and was considered a major city. Thus, the merchants of Sioux City were soon drawn to Liangzhou to do business. The northern markets had also become more vibrant and bustling thanks to the addition of those merchants. After the first batch of merchants in Sioux City brought in their first profits, the reputation of the northern markets spread further and further. Soon, merchants from faraway places started traveling to Liangzhou. In this age where everything depended on word of mouth, the more the number of people, the more the city would flourish. Once these people entered Liangzhou City, they would add on to Liangzhou's dwindling population. With the northern market having turned into a grand market and drawing more people in, there were more and more people settling in Liangzhou City daily. She also had to look through the various types of new teas she had bought on the mountain and filter out what she needed. Thus, they had to limit the scope of their tea operations for now. Once everything was ready, it would be time to expand the market. TL note: food porn is back. Unfortunately, this will be the last food porn until the end, because we're in for the conclusion of the major plot. These all look really sweet and tasty. I've never tried any of these, unfortunately, as they seem to be local specialties from China. The cloud cakes look really interesting though. Glutinous rice cakes, yam and jujube cakes, 4 joys dumplings, cloud cakes. Another view of cloud cakes. I also found this video showing how glutinous rice cakes are made. Chapter 685, Baby Moving 1. Zhou took a mental note of Chu Lian's instructions before shooting a challenge at Manager Qin with his eyes. Manager Qin snorted disdainfully. Chu Lian was watching, but she couldn't do anything about it. Although they were both her equally capable assistants, the 2 men were in the peak of their youth and they both had an area that they specialized in. While they were helping Chu Lian to manage different businesses, they were secretly comparing themselves to each other and working harder to outshine their rival. Manager Qin paused in thought before asking, "Madam, should I continue depositing the profits from the northern market into the bank?" He had discovered recently that the money in the bank had all been withdrawn. Manager Qin had found it strange, but he hadn't asked about it out of tact. Chu Lian nodded. It wasn't just the northern market's profits. Once the tea mountain started normal production, its profits would also be deposited into the same bank account. Since things hadn't settled down yet, they would only need more and more money as time passed. Once the two managers were done with their reports, they both left. Chu Lian had been becoming less and less mobile these few days, so they didn't want to disturb their master's rest. Chu Lian took another light sip of jasmine tea. Although it was already early autumn, it was still hot outside. She couldn't drink green tea to curb the heat due to her little one, so she could only drink some flower tea to make do. She gazed out over the lotus pond and enjoyed the cool breeze blowing over. The ripples and vibrant greenery on the pond soothed the heat of her body a little. Today, she was wearing a light purple dress with long sleeves and a pink sash draped over her shoulders. The dress was decorated with albizia flowers. All she had in the way of accessories was a simple plum blossom jade hairpin to secure her bun. She hadn't even worn earrings. Her face was glowing from within, and she had a healthy blush on her cheeks. She looked even better than before she had gotten pregnant. Senior servants Zhong and Gue thought that Chu Lian's outfit was far too humble, so they had pulled out a box of forehead ornaments for Chu Lian to pick from. Chu Lian couldn't get the two senior servants to budge, so she picked out a beautiful golden lotus to paste on her forehead. As the sunlight streamed through the gaps in the tree canopy above, some rays would shine on Chu Lian's forehead, lighting up the golden lotus ornament. The reflected sunlight gave the illusion of a golden glow around her. Just as she was calculating the projected income from the northern market and dejuifing in her mind, there was a sudden movement from her belly, causing Chu Lian to freeze up. This was her baby moving. Chapter 686, Baby Moving 2. In the first 3 months, He Changdi had still obediently slept on the chaise beside the bed. However, now he refused to let her sleep alone in bed. Ignoring the protests of the two senior servants, He Changdi had removed the chaise by the bed and was now hugging her to sleep every night. He would even help her turn around at times. Sometimes, when it came to midnight, Chu Lian would suffer cramping in her legs. Since she slept in his arms, the moment she moved, he would wake immediately and help her with the cramps. As time passed and he became used to his work, Chu Lian was starting to feel that her husband had become even better than Shi Yan at taking care of her. Chu Lian was still in the midst of a daze. She turned to look up at He Changdi with blank eyes. When He Changdi noticed that there wasn't any pain in her expression, he first heaved a sigh of relief before placing a kiss on her cheek. He lowered his voice and whispered gently into her ear, "What happened?" Something moved within her bloated belly again. This time, Chu Lian was completely sure of what was going on. She came back to her senses and burst into a wide smile. She replied He Changdi with an equally soft voice, "Hubby, he's moving." The novice dad was completely confused. The smile on Chu Lian's face widened into a grin until her eyes were sparkling. She pulled He Changdi's hand over and set it down on her belly. The little bun then helpfully gave another tiny kick. He Changdi was trained in martial arts, so his 5 senses were stronger than most. He could clearly feel a bump suddenly appearing on the smooth skin he was touching, before subsiding back down. He reacted just like Chu Lian had and froze up entirely. Cracks started appearing in his frozen expression as he processed what was going on. The weird look on his face made Chu Lian burst out into peals of bell-like laughter. She covered He Changdi's hand with her own and wrapped her other arm around his neck. She looked up at him, full of smiles, as she continued watching his expression change. This was the first time she had felt the baby move in her whole pregnancy. Being able to share in this moment with her loved one was a different sort of bliss. He Changdi gulped hard. His normally clear eyes were now clouded over in bewilderment. He asked stupidly, "This is our child moving?" Chu Lian nodded with a smile. "The little fellow is saying his to his dad." As she was talking, He Changdi could feel another bump under his hands. This time, the baby kicked much harder than before. Perhaps he had sensed his dear dad on the other side, so he wasn't holding back in the last. The force of this kick made Chu Lian gasp a little. He Changdi's expression immediately turned into a frown upon seeing this. His face turned somewhat overcast as he asked, "Does it hurt?" Chu Lian shook her head. "I'm fine." He Changdi rubbed a circle around his wife's belly. "Why is this rascal so disobedient?" The smile dropped from Chu Lian's face and she rolled her eyes at her husband. "He's only a few months old. It's just a subconscious reaction from our little fellow." He Changdi let out a cold chuckle, which sent a chill down Chu Lian's spine. "He doesn't know how to take care of you even while in your belly. Well, let's see how I'll take care of him when he's out." A twitch developed in the corner of Chu Lian's mouth. "Are there any dads like you? He hasn't even been born yet, and you're already thinking of how to discipline him. He should be glad he's not out yet, or it won't just be a verbal threat." Chu Lian had no words to reply to that. However, perhaps the little fellow had realized that he was being threatened by his dear old dad. Later on, whenever He Changdi was by Chu Lian's side, he refused to move at all. Standing far off behind the corner of a wall, Mu Xiang stared at the happy couple hugging in the pavilion with dead eyes. Her lip was already red from how hard she was biting it. There was a poisonous look in her eyes. She wanted Chu Lian to just fall right into the lotus pond. Her fists were already clenched so tight that her nails were digging into the flesh of her palm, while her expression was contorted into an ugly mask. She had been enduring for all this time, but it was finally time to take action. In this lifetime, anyone who stole away her husband would die a gruesome death, even if it was someone in her previous body. Chapter 687. Praying. 1. There was a special custom in the capital. Pregnant women would have to visit the temple at least once to pray for an uneventful birth, as well as for their firstborn to be a boy. As a modern person, Chu Lian understood that the gender of her child wasn't something that could be changed just by praying to the Buddha. The moment her little bun came into existence, his or her gender had already been set. Doing anything else to try to change that would be fruitless. However, she knew that her knowledge wasn't shared by the others around her. Near the end of July, Countess Jinggan came to visit her often and kept trying to persuade her to visit Dan Temple. Countess Jinggan even hinted subtly that this was also part of matriarchy's wishes. This was a time when the political situation in court was in turmoil. He Changdi would explain to her about the various movements in court when he returned home every day. She also knew clearly that the peace on the surface was hiding a major battle in the capital. The factions of 4th Prince and 6th Prince were locked in a long war now. Since He Changdi was Prince Jin's most trusted assistant, there were plenty of eyes on the Anyuan estate right now. As a helpless woman carrying around an unborn heir, what she should do was to stay in the well-protected estate and sit quietly until her child was ready to come into the world. However, Countess Jinggan had already come over to remind her a few times. Even Princess Wei had told her to go to the temple. Chu Lian rubbed her swollen belly and sighed helplessly. Sometimes, even though she knew that her action would be useless, she would have to do it regardless. Matriarch He, Countess Jinggan, and Princess Wei were all her seniors. They carried the hopes of the entire Jinggan estate, as well as Prince Wei's estate. She couldn't just reject their kindly reminders without a good reason. Chu Lian looked down at her belly. It wasn't very big right now. If she waited any longer, it would be even harder to travel when she was 7 months pregnant. So why not make the trip a little earlier? Thus, Chu Lian discussed the matter with He Changdi. He Changdi wanted to reject the request at first. He was more worried for Chu Lian's safety. As for the little one inside her, he didn't care about their gender since the little one would be their child regardless. They were still young. Even if their first child was a daughter, they could just have another child if they wanted a son. However, when he turned to see Chu Lian facing him with her puppy eyes, he couldn't bear to turn her down. He recalled the bias that his grandmother had against his wife. If he didn't agree to this, grandmother would likely blame it on Chu Lian. If their first child wasn't a boy as grandmother wanted, then the one who suffered would likely be his wife again. He Sanling mulled over it for a long time before agreeing reluctantly. Chapter 688. Praying 2. Since they were afraid of any untoward incidents, once August had arrived, Chu Lian's close servants had started making preparations. On the morning of the 10th of August, Xian was suddenly overcome with a high fever. The ones chosen to accompany Chu Lian on this trip were Wenqing and Xian. Wenlan had gone to the tea garden, and it would take a few days for her to return to the estate. Since Xian wasn't feeling well in the morning, they could only find a replacement for her. There were only Xian, Wenqing, Wenlan, and Muxiang serving Chu Lian as her 4 personal handmaids. The only one most suitable to take Xian's place was Muxiang. Ever since Chu Lian had gotten pregnant and Muxiang had been sent here to serve her by the matriarch, Muxiang had been behaving properly over the past few months. Furthermore, she worked swiftly and got along well with the other maidservants. Even Wenqing, Wenlan, and Xian had stopped guarding against her. Senior servants Gue and Zhong were both troubled. The 2 senior servants were still reluctant to bring Muxiang along. Since they would be traveling out of the estate, they would have to take care of their madam the whole way. As amiable as Muxiang was, she had only been serving for a few months, and she was still considered one of matriarchy's servants. The 2 of them hadn't forgotten how matriarchy had been biased against Chu Lian when they had moved out of the Jinggan estate. Compared to Muxiang, the 2 senior servants trusted the second-tier maidservant Bai Chaomor. Just as senior servant Zhong was about to speak, Muxiang stepped up. She bobbed naturally to Chu Lian, a trace of worry showing in her expression. Since Xian isn't well, please let this servant serve madam today. When Chu Lian heard that the sick Xian had seemingly relaxed upon hearing Muxiang bravely volunteer as her replacement, she bowed her head and pretended to think about it for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Fine, you can come along today. Baicha, take care of Xian. Get Uncle Miao here to take a look at her. Why did she suddenly fall ill?" Baicha immediately replied in the affirmative and turned to stride towards Xian's room, where the ill maidservant was resting. "All right, it's getting late. Hurry up and pack these up. When my husband is back from court, we'll move out." Chu Lian was helped over to a wooden chair in the outer room by Wenqing. Senior servant Zhong came out along with them. Chu Lian glanced over at the senior servant. When she caught sight of the hesitant expression on senior servant Zhong, she asked, "Momo, is there anything you wish to say?" Senior servant Zhong was startled by the question. "Madam, this servant is afraid it won't be too good to let Muxiang go with us." Chu Lian had guessed that she would say that. She patted the elderly servant's hand to reassure her. "Don't worry about it. Even if she has any bad intentions, she's just one person. With my husband nearby, what can she do?" Since her master had already said so, senior servant Zhong kept the rest of her worries to herself. She sighed inwardly. There were some things that Chu Lian still wasn't cautious enough about. Actually, she found it rather strange. Chu Lian was normally quite prudent and treasured her life very much. Why would she suddenly act so carelessly? She was carrying 2 lives now. Even if Muxiang was a weak maidservant, if she really wanted to do anything bad, she might be able to. Perhaps the pregnancy had affected her master's brain, made her more foolish? That didn't seem right. Just 2 days ago, Zhou and manager Qin had been singing Madam's praises in her ear for her marvelous ideas for the northern market and Dijufeng. Senior servant Zhong had no choice but to turn back inside and order Wenqing to watch Muxiang carefully. While Wenqing felt that there wasn't any need to, she still agreed. Once Changdi returned from court, he changed into a comfortable set of robes and accompanied Chu Lian out. Countess Jinggan was already waiting in the outer court of the Anyuan estate. When they neared the entrance of their estate, Changdi personally helped Chu Lian into the carriage. Chu Lian and Wenqing were to share a carriage with Countess Jinggan, while Muxiang and Countess Jinggan's handmaid, as well as a female doctor she had brought along, were to share another carriage. Changdi would be mounted on his horse and lead the guards protecting both sides of the carriage. However, as they were traveling on the roads and before they had even reached the foot of Mount Lanxiang, a fast horse came chasing after them from behind. Chapter 689. Who are you? 1. Liyue turned around and frowned upon seeing the mounted man. With a twitch of his reins, he went up to Changdi's side and leaned over to whisper, "Master, it's Brother Zhang. Of course, He Changdi knew that Lai Yue was referring to Zhang Mai. His expression changed, and he instructed the guards to look after the convoy. He then urged his horse up to the carriage to tell them what he was planning to do before turning back and heading in Zhang Mei's direction to welcome him. Chu Lian was in the middle of chatting with Countess Jinggan when He Changdi passed his message to them. Countess Jinggan frowned. Why is Sanlang so busy even at this time? Chu Lian wasn't angry at all. Instead, she even smiled and reassured Countess Jinggan. Mother, you might not know this, but there's been some turmoil in the capital lately. Hubby has been very busy, so let him go and take a look. Since Brother Zhang has come personally, it must be something important. Countess Jinggan sighed. She thought back to the past and lamented. We're in the same boat then. When I was pregnant with Erlang and Sanlang, your father was also very busy and was rarely by my side. However, at least Sanlang's wife had a little more fortune than she had. Back then, when she had been pregnant, Count Jinggan had already returned to Mingzhou to take his post. Nowadays, even though He Changdi was busy with his work, at least he was nearby and he could find time to spend with Chu Lian. Chu Lian's smile brightened up even more. Actually, she wasn't as calm and confident as she appeared on the surface. In a short moment, Lai Yue spoke up from outside the carriage. Madam, third young madam, what's wrong? Third young madam, third young master has been called away by Brother Zhang on urgent business. He told this servant to pass it on. Of course, Countess Jinggan could hear everything that Lai Yue had said to Chu Lian. Sanlang's wife, since Sanlang has left, why don't we head back to the estate first and find another day to visit the temple? Without He Changdi here, Countess Jinggan couldn't rest easy with her heavily pregnant daughter-in-law in tow. Furthermore, everyone held such great expectations for Chu Lian's unborn child. They had to take as many precautions as they could. Chu Lian shook her head and consoled her mother-in-law. Mother, there's no need for that. We've already picked out our guards early on, and we even have 2 of our family soldiers following. It's only hubby who isn't around, but we have so many people guarding us, it won't be that easy for something bad to happen. Furthermore, we really can't wait any longer. Look at the size of my belly. If we go back now, who knows when we'll be able to go out again? Countess Jinggan was swayed by Chu Lian after all. The party continued on their way to Dan Temple as per their original plans. After an hour, they finally arrived at the foot of Mount Lanxiang. It wasn't supposed to take that long, but since Chu Lian was pregnant, they had kept the carriages to a safe and slow speed. Thus, they had taken 2 times the normal duration to reach the temple. There was a special road for the nobility at the foot of Mount Lanxiang, and He Changdi had already arranged for his subordinates to guide them from there. Wenqing and Mu Xiang alighted from the carriage behind and went up to Chu Lian and Countess Jinggan's carriage. Once the curtains were lifted, Countess Jinggan stepped off the carriage first. Following that, Mu Xiang managed to beat Wenqing to the punch and helped Chu Lian off the carriage. Wenqing could only stand at the side and watch. Lai Yue led 2 guards over. Madam, third young madam, the palanquins are ready. While Mount Lanxiang wasn't a very tall mountain, it still wasn't as easy to walk on as the highway. Even on the special path for the nobles, it wasn't as flat as a normal road. It wasn't possible to travel up the mountain on a horse or a carriage. They could only depend on manpower to climb the mountain. Thus, there were plenty of porters and palanquins for hire at the foot of the mountain. Chu Lian wouldn't be able to climb with her huge belly, so Wenqing and Mu Xiang helped her over to a palanquin. The palanquin was woven from rattan and made for 2 porters to carry at both ends. A rattan chair was set in the middle with a nice roof to keep the sun off the rider's head. Although it was rather crude, it was very light. Since it was lighter than most sedan chairs, it was perfect for climbing mountains. Once Chu Lian and Countess Jinggan were each seated in a palanquin, Lai Yue called for the party to start the climb. Mu Xiang followed alongside Chu Lian's palanquin. She turned to Wenqing and said, Wenqing, you should go and take care of madam. I can take care of third young madam alone. The handmaid Countess Jinggan had sprained her ankle while getting off the carriage, so she had stayed at the foot of the mountain with the carriage. Right now, there was only an elderly senior servant taking care of Countess Jinggan. Wenqing hesitated for a moment before nodding. She quickened her stride to catch up to Countess Jinggan's palanquin. It was hot out. After the party had been climbing for 15 minutes, everyone was covered in sweat. Since they were in a mountain forest, there were trees all around, blocking the breeze from reaching them. However, the trees on either side of the road had been cleared away, so there was no shelter from the relentless sunlight beating down. Chu Lian waved the fan in her hands and wiped at the sweat on her forehead with a handkerchief. She pulled out a white porcelain bottle from her waist pouch and poured out a single brown pill and swallowed it. Mu Xiang had been observing her this whole time. Chapter 690. Who are you? 2. At the halfway mark up the mountain, Mu Xiang noticed a signal hidden in the bushes and made a discreet hand gesture. A group of masked men on horses abruptly charged out from either side of the silent mountain road. They immediately got into a skirmish with the guards of the Anyuan estate. One of the strong masked men, wearing a short tunic with bunched-up sleeves, charged straight towards Countess Jinggan with his sword drawn. Wenqing had been about to rush to Chu Lian's side, but she had no choice but to draw her own sword and block the man's attack for the Countess instead. The clashing of swords resounded in the forest. Mu Xiang was shouting for the guards to protect Chu Lian, but Lai Yue and their stronger guards were all blocked by the masked men. The palanquin that Chu Lian was seated in was stolen away by the two gray-clad porters carrying her. Another man stuffed a rag in Muxiang's mouth and carried her away with them. The masked men seemed to lose all desire to fight once they had completed the kidnapping. One of their leaders made a hand signal, and the group of masked men dispersed just as quickly as they had arrived. In just a short 15 minutes, there was only a group of injured guards and the shell-shocked Countess Jinggan left at the halfway mark of the mountain. When Countess Jinggan realized that Chu Lian had been kidnapped, she collapsed to the ground in fright and roared angrily, "Chase them down! No matter what, you have to bring Sanlang's wife back safely in one piece." Her voice was trembling as she gave orders to Lai Yue. "Hurry, send some men to pass the news to Third Young Master and Prince Weiss Estate. Quickly." Their family soldier, Huang Zhijian, had already led a party of guards after the kidnappers. Lai Yue quickly instructed some men to send the report. He didn't dare to lead the pursuit himself at the moment since Countess Jinggan was still here. They had already lost one of their madams. They couldn't let anything happen to the other. So her two porters had been part of the setup. She looked around her surroundings constantly, but since this was the forested area of Mount Lanxiang, other than bushes and trees, there was nothing she could use as landmarks. She pressed her lips and accidentally brushed against the pouch at her waist, causing some tiny fragments to fall out. Under these pressing circumstances, no one noticed the light-colored powder falling from Chu Lian's ouch. Chu Lian turned her gaze to Mu Xiang, who had been tied up and was being carried on someone's shoulder. The maidservant's head had been covered by a cloth bag, so she couldn't see the servant's expression at the moment. However, what seemed strange to Chu Lian was how Mu Xiang had reacted at first. She had struggled with all her might at the start, but after they had left the line of sight of Lai Yue and the others, Mu Xiang had suddenly stopped moving as if she had fainted. Chu Lian. A chill ran up Chu Lian's spine as she stared up at Mu Xiang with wide eyes. Mu Xiang stared right back at her with an expression warped with anger. Chapter 691. The Evil Female Lead, 1. The corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. She felt that she had been completely shafted by the heavens. It was bad enough that she had suddenly transmigrated into a novel that she had only read halfway into the body of the evil female lead, no less. She could accept not being able to return to the modern world, since she had no ties keeping her there anyway. Do the heavens really have to play with me like this? I don't even have any cheats to use. How am I going to survive this? I've had enough. At first, her husband had suddenly turned bad. Then now there was this abnormal maidservant. Don't tell her that Mu Xiang would turn out to be the reincarnated original female lead. She wanted to gift her just 2 words. Ha ha. A twitch developed in Chu Lian's forehead. She looked at Mu Xiang, who seemed to be filled with hate and fury for her, with a strange expression. You're the original Chu Lian? Mu Xiang was staring closely at Chu Lian's face, not wanting to miss out on even the most minute change in her expression. She had been waiting patiently for so long, all just for this moment. To see the shock, alarm, and fear on the face of the freak that had stolen her body, to revel as the freak fell to the ground on her knees to beg for mercy. A torrent of emotions was flooding her heart right now. She couldn't hold back the burgeoning excitement in her, which showed in her trembling body. Right now, looking down from above at this woman that He Changdi had protected like a delicate little flower in a greenhouse, there was a sense of satisfaction and elation she couldn't name. She was waiting for Chu Lian to give up and beg her for mercy. After that, she would simply laugh right in her face and kill her last remaining hope. She would first make her lose her child, then torment her and make her suffer. In the end, she would make sure that this imposter died without a corpse to bury. This way, once the freak in her original body died without a trace, she would then take her rightful place as the real Marchioness Anyuan. Mu Xiang was absolutely thrilled at the thought. However, as Mu Xiang continued waiting, what came wasn't the scene she had imagined. Chu Lian faced Muxiang's gaze straight on. One of them was looking downwards, while the other was looking upwards. The two of them blinked in unison, then again, like some silent play. Chu Lian was finding it strange why Mu Xiang was giving her an expectant look, as if she was waiting for something. She didn't understand. What did Mu Xiang want from her at this point? She had indeed taken Muxiang's original body, but it wasn't as if she had wanted it. She hadn't had any say in the matter. Furthermore, the original Chu Lian had been an evil woman with a poisonous heart. She hadn't even hesitated when killing. For the sake of her own benefit, who knows how many people had fallen beneath her claws. Even back in the Ying estate, when the original female lead had been ignored by everyone and had lived a terrible life beneath even a handmaid that didn't have anything to do with the current Chu Lian. Chu Lian had the confidence to say that she hadn't done anything bad ever since she had come to the Great Wu dynasty. She had also respected her seniors and supported her husband. She didn't have any bit of remorse towards the original owner of this body. Strictly speaking, she was the most innocent victim here. Since that was so, she really had no idea what Mu Xiang was waiting for. The satisfied expression on Muxiang's face started to contort. Her eyes got wider and wider, as disbelief sunk into her over how the situation was changing. She had imagined many times over how the current Chu Lian would beg pathetically on her knees, pleading for her not to reveal this tremendous secret to He Changdi. However, she hadn't expected Chu Lian to be so calm. Was she really not the slightest bit afraid? Was she really that fearless? When she faced Chu Lian's moist eyes, Mu Xiang bit her lip hard, almost drawing blood. She pointed a trembling finger at the bewildered Chu Lian in agitation. Her voice was shaking from her anger. Aren't you the slightest bit guilty? That's my body you're in. Am the real Marchioness Anyuan. Aren't you afraid that I'll tell the truth to He Changdi? That you're not Chu Lian, and that you're just a freak? Aren't you scared that he'll shun you once he finds out? Chu Lian was still stunned by the revelation, despite everything. So the soul inside Mu Xiang was the original Chu Lian. However, just like Mu Xiang had said, Chu Lian really didn't care if Mu Xiang were to reveal the truth to He Changdi. If He Changdi really chose to part ways with her based on that alone, then it was He Changdi who wasn't worth her trust and love. She would have nothing to say to him if he broke up with her over a reason like that. Also, what rubbish was she saying? Even if Mu Xiang was still in her original body, going by the way the original novel had developed, she wouldn't have become a Marchioness regardless. A thought suddenly surfaced in Chu Lian's mind. Since Chu Lian had become Mu Xiang, going by the novel's original plot, shouldn't she have gone to look for Xiao Bojian instead? Wasn't Xiao Bojian her true love? Why was she aiming for He Changdi now? Even if Chu Lian were to say that she had chosen He Sanlang for his power now, it didn't make sense. He Changdi did hold high status and authority now, and he was currently occupying a good position in court. However, Xiao Bojian was doing equally well for himself. If they were to compare the status of both men, Xiao Bojian would likely be able to stand equally with He Changdi now. The Jinggan estate wasn't a particularly old or rich noble house either, so there shouldn't be any attraction there. Since it was so, It was worth thinking further on why Mu Xiang had still ended up choosing He Changdi. Since she had already transmigrated into this book, nothing seemed impossible. If she were to make a few bold assumptions, could it be that Mu Xiang had regretted her choices in her past life, that is, the events in the original novel, and was now choosing He Changdi wholeheartedly in this life? Chu Lian hid the guesses in her heart. On the surface, she narrowed her eyes at Mu Xiang. Why do I have to be scared? Even if this body was originally yours, I don't owe you anything. Chapter 692. The Evil Female Lead, 2. Chu Lian's abnormal calm was like a thorn in Muxiang's side. She shoved at Chu Lian with all her strength, pushing her down to the ground, and watched as Chu Lian sprawled pitifully over the floor, her two hands wrapped around her swollen body in protection. Only then did she feel like she had vented some of her frustration. Luckily, there was the pile of hay nearby, or Chu Lian would have been really worried about her child. She purposely chose to land in a haphazard pose to make herself seem more pathetic. Muxiang's tone was cynical as she replied, "You don't owe me anything? You're really a freak. You have absolutely no shame to be able to say such words. You took my body. You stole my husband. Isn't that enough? You freak. You're the most shameless person I've ever met. If not for you, Gillen Restaurant, Di Jufeng Restaurant, the Northern Market, and those noble titles, wouldn't all those be mine? You've taken so many of my things, yet you're telling me that you don't owe me anything? Did you think you could simply enjoy living well like this? Dream on. I'm sending you down to hell today." Mu Xiang had gone crazy with jealousy. Due to the events of her past life, as well as her current life as a lowly maidservant, how could she endure seeing how Chu Lian was living right now? She wasn't satisfied with the end she had gotten in her past life, of seeing the freak who had stolen her body living 1,000 times better than she had. How could her heart possibly be content? The gap in their lives had quickly warped Muxiang's heart. Chu Lian really thought that the original female lead had something wrong with her mind. She bowed her head without meeting Muxiang's gaze, making it look as if she had given up and accepted Muxiang's words. Mu Xiang looked down upon Chu Lian, sprawled on the ground with her swollen belly, not daring to even look at her. She sneered. "What? Now you're finally feeling scared?" She suddenly squatted down and stroked Chu Lian's tender cheek. Her hand slid down Chu Lian's body, landed on her belly, and pressed down hard. Her voice was sinister as she continued, "I was very surprised when you got pregnant with He Changdi's child. Furthermore, this impostor had used her body to do that. The provocation in that action had driven her even more mad with envy. In the past life, she hadn't been able to get pregnant at all despite being by Xiao Bojian's side. It was only right before her death that she found out that Xiao Bojian had given her a secret medicine that made her infertile. She had assumed wrongly that Xiao Bojian had given her the medicine early on, while they had been in the Ying estate, so she had thought that her old body was still infertile. Now she knew that Chu Lian's body was actually completely healthy. It was perfect, and she could use it to bear children for the man she loved. However, the soul inside wasn't her anymore. How could she not be jealous? Chu Lian could discern the change in her voice, that Mu Xiang had completely lost her rationality. Chu Lian kept both of her hands on the ground, prepared to protect her stomach at any time. As expected, Muxiang's next words confirmed Chu Lian's suspicions. "What a pity. You've already carried the child for so long, but this child is unfortunate. I wonder whether it's a boy or a girl in there. But we won't have to wonder for long. We'll take the child out and let you see for yourself. You can see whether you and He Changdi's child is handsome, whether he looks more like He Changdi or you." This woman must have gone mad. She actually managed to spit out such cruel words. The calm on Chu Lian's face faded, replaced with a deathly pale pallor. Noticing that Chu Lian's shoulders were trembling, Mu Xiang burst out into sinister laughter. "Why? Are you finally scared?" Chu Lian bowed her head, counting inwardly. She had already found out whatever she wanted from Mu Xiang, so there was no longer any need to play around with her. She was waiting. Mu Xiang seemed to have lost interest in tormenting Chu Lian with her words. She turned around and took up a pouch on the table. The mad maidservant, pulled a sharp dagger out of it, and started walking towards Chu Lian step by step. When Chu Lian saw that she was holding a dagger, she carefully shifted backwards a little. Her lips formed into a thin line. Mu Xiang had a crazy wide grin on her face. She squatted down and raised her arms. That sharp dagger pointed at Chu Lian's belly. In the next second, she made her move. On the verge of life and death, a whoosh accompanied the sight of a fast object shooting through the air. That sharp arrow was much faster than the dagger, and it shot right through Mu Xiang. The enormous force behind the arrow actually lifted up Muxiang's body and stuck her to the opposing mud wall like a pin. Mu Xiang let out an intense wail. A tall figure appeared at the entrance of the thatched hut. Chu Lian was still in a panicked state when she turned her head to look, only to see He Changdi standing there in a black robe, carrying a giant bow. He was standing ramrod straight at the door, an icy aura emanating from his frosty expression. His sinister gaze landed upon the pinned Mu Xiang. Following that, he hurried forward to Chu Lian's side. Tossing aside his bow without a care, he lifted Chu Lian up from the pile of hay and wrapped her in his embrace. Once Chu Lian was ensconced in her husband's arms and his comforting scent, she slowly came back to her senses. In a flurry of action, she hugged He Changdi's neck and buried her face into his chest. She let out a sniffle as she complained, "He Changdi, I was so scared." The murderous expression on He Sanlang's face faded away. He watched his lovely and fragile wife as he soothed her by patting her back. He reassured her with a soft, low tone, "It's okay, Lianer. It's all over. They'll bring you out now." After saying so, he walked out while carrying Chu Lian. Captain Gua, Zhang Mai and Xiao Hongyu all came up to surround them, asking worriedly, "How is sister-in-law?" He Changdi faced everyone with his usual cool expression and shook his head. "They'll leave the person inside to you. They'll send Lianer back first." Captain Gua patted his shoulder and entered the thatched hut with the others. Chu Lian looked around them, only to see that her masked kidnappers were all lying on the ground, motionless. She raised her chin to look up at He Changdi's defined chin. She pressed her lips together and shoved her head even deeper into his chest, trying to surround herself with the scent that made her feel safe. Chapter 693. Teaching his wife a lesson, one of course. They ended up abandoning their plans to visit Dan Temple. He Changdi brought Chu Lian along with him down the mountain. At the foot of Mount Lanxiang was a carriage that He Sanlang had ordered to wait for them. He Changdi carried Chu Lian into the carriage, before he boarded the carriage himself and sat next to her. There was a basin of ice already placed within the carriage, as well as thick curtains at the window and door. The moment they entered, there was a soothing, cool atmosphere to welcome them. The carriage quickly started moving. He Changdi continued wrapping Chu Lian in his long arms. Afraid of disturbing her belly, he only touched her shoulders. Now that everything was over and he had Chu Lian to fill the space between his arms, the fretfulness and fear in He Changdi's heart dissipated completely. He rested his chin on the top of Chu Lian's head and took a deep breath, taking in Chu Lian's familiar scent. He shut his eyes to calm down the torrent of emotions within him. Chu Lian was trapped in his embrace, unable to move. She understood that she had really been on the verge of danger earlier. If He Changdi had been late by a few seconds, then the little fellow in her belly might have been lost to them. She parted her lips a few times, but she didn't know what to say. Chu Lian knew that He Changdi must have been waiting outside the hut for some time. Mu Xiang had said so much to her, and she didn't know how much he had heard. Did he already know that she wasn't the real Chu Lian? Did he know that Mu Xiang was a reincarnated person? What was he thinking right now? The ancients feared the supernatural. They would have a fearful sort of reverence towards anything they didn't understand. Would he really hurt her because of the truth? Would he also think that she was a freak? Although she had retorted to Mu Xiang so confidently just now that she was in front of He Changdi, Chu Lian wasn't as certain of herself anymore. Sometimes, this was how things were between lovers. The deeper you loved, the more you would fear losing them and facing their disappointment. It was also precisely because she cared for him that she didn't know how to start this conversation. After a long moment, when He Changdi had finally regained a modicum of calm, he opened his dark eyes. He put a little distance between them by pushing Chu Lian further back a little, then helped her to switch into a more comfortable position, leaning against his chest. He Changdi lowered his gaze to observe the slightly pale face of his wife. Her thick eyelashes were trembling, and her pink lips were tightly pressed together. It was clear as day that she was currently tense and fighting an inner struggle. He could see through her thoughts in one glance and found it funny. His eyes landed on her swollen belly. A wave of fear swept through him, and the soft expression on his face made way for an extremely gloomy expression. He lifted one hand and landed a resounding smack on Chu Lian's pert and soft bottom. Before Chu Lian could react from her shock, he gave her another slap on her butt. He Changdi made 3 slaps in total before he finally stopped. Since it was summer, they wore thinner clothes. He Sanlang's slaps had made crisp and clear sounds. It wasn't just the guards following them on either side of the carriage who could hear the slaps, but even Liyue, who was in front driving the carriage. Liyue froze up a little and sat up straighter. He put on a serious expression and pretended that he hadn't heard anything, as if nothing had happened at all. He also pretended not to see the questioning looks that the guards sent him. Liyue lambasted his own master for being too vicious and ruthless in his mind. He could even bear to lay his hands on a fragile young lady like third young madam. He definitely had to light a candle in sympathy for his unborn young master. Chu Lian had been trapped in her mental conflict when He Changdi had suddenly attacked her. After the 3 slaps, her entire body went stiff. He Changdi hadn't given her any mercy this time. Her left buttock was on fire. She stared with wide, round eyes in disbelief at He Changdi. Astonishment and complaint shone through in her almond-shaped eyes. "You deserved that. Do you know how much danger you would have been in if I hadn't made it in time?" The scolding that Chu Lian had wanted to unleash was immediately snuffed out by He Changdi. Chu Lian lowered her head and thought for a bit, but she still felt that these 3 slaps were just too much. She spoke up grumpily. "Didn't we agree on the plan previously? How could you possibly be late?" He Changdi sighed. When he saw that the corners of her eyes were red and how tough it was for her to lug her heavy body around, his hardened heart melted back down once again. He reached out with one hand and rubbed at the spots that he had just smacked, helping her to soothe the pain. "Better safe than sorry. Next time, even if we don't have any better ideas, you're not allowed to put yourself on the line. If anything happens to you, how am I going to continue living alone?" He Changdi softened his tone and spoke in a coaxing manner to Chu Lian. Seeing that her face was still flushed with anger, he bent down to place a gentle kiss on her lips. They had long suspected that there was something wrong with Mu Xiang. He Changdi had used his men to investigate her. After a thorough investigation, he had actually discovered that Mu Xiang had even secretly sent messages to Xiao Bojian spies before. Seeing how big Chu Lian was getting, and since they were nearing the birth, they couldn't let someone like her continue staying beside them. He Changdi wanted to find an excuse to send Mu Xiang away from Chu Lian. However, Chu Lian hadn't agreed. She thought that it would only solve the immediate danger, but not get rid of the threat once and for all. The mastermind behind everything would also hide even deeper. Now that the battle between the factions of 4th Prince and 6th Prince was getting even more intense, they couldn't leave any threat roaming free. Thus, she had insisted on using this chance to lure the snake out of its hole. He Changdi hadn't been able to persuade her otherwise, so he could only let her execute her plan. Both Chu Lian and He Changdi hadn't expected things to end up like this. Mu Xiang was actually the original inhabitant of Chu Lian's body. Due to her jealousy and hatred for Chu Lian, she had actually wanted to take Chu Lian's life. When He Changdi had been waiting outside the door, he had watched as Mu Xiang raise the dagger above Chu Lian. The man who had always been calm and collected on the battlefield had almost had a heart attack. Luckily, he was skilled with the bow, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to protect his wife. Chapter 694. Teaching his wife a lesson. 2. Chu Lian was rendered speechless by He Changdi's words. Thinking back to the close call she had in the thatched hut, a wave of residual fear washed over her. Even though she had eaten great Dr. Miao's specially made medicine to stabilize the fetus, her belly wouldn't have been able to withstand that stab from Muxiang. She had indeed put herself in too much risk and danger this time. The unhappy and indignant feelings from earlier dissipated. She looked down at her swollen belly and rubbed the top of it to soothe both herself and her unborn child. Chu Lian apologized in her mind. "Little fellow, mother has let you suffer." He Changdi saw that his wife had understood what he had to say. He covered Chu Lian's small and soft hand with his own and joined her in stroking her belly. "Don't worry, this little one has been quite obedient so far. The little one won't blame you." Chu Lian shrunk into He Changdi's embrace and clutched his lapels. After a long period of silence, she mumbled indistinctly, "He Changdi, I won't do that again." Hearing that promise from Chu Lian, the corners of He Changdi's mouth curled up. He tucked some stray locks of her hair behind her ear. After a moment, Chu Lian puffed up her cheeks and turned around to look up at him. She glared at his handsome, yet expressionless face. "Although I was in the wrong, how could you hit me so hard?" He Changdi glanced down at her flushed cheeks. "Was it too hard?" Chu Lian nodded profusely. He Changdi replied in an absolutely nonchalant and calm manner. "Then I'll let you return the hits when we get back." Chu Lian. Her mouth twitched and she rolled her eyes furiously. She looked towards his robes and felt even more depressed. What was so nice to touch about a man's buttocks? It was all hard and tough muscle there. She didn't have any perverted inclinations. After her initial train of thought had been interrupted by He Changdi, Chu Lian temporarily forgot about her inner struggle. She had the feeling that He Changdi's attitude towards her hadn't changed at all even after this incident. She suddenly lost the urge to ask him about it. Learning in He Changdi's safe and comfortable embrace, Chu Lian quickly dozed off. Pregnant women were prone to sleeping more anyway, and she had already suffered a fright earlier. Actually, she was already very sleepy. Once Chu Lian fell asleep, He Changdi knocked on the walls of the carriage and ordered Laiwe to drive the carriage a little slower. He looked down at the soundly sleeping wife in his arms. He couldn't seem to get enough of looking at her porcelain-like face, no matter how much he had already seen. Thinking back to the completely different personalities of the Chu Lian from his past life and this one, he suddenly felt glad that he had still left some space in his heart to accept her after he had reincarnated, and even more glad that he had won her over. It seemed like the heavens were still fair to him. The woman lying in his arms now was his true wife. She had never been that wicked woman Chu Lian from his previous life. The intelligent and sharp-witted He Sanlang suddenly burst into a silly grin while watching his wife sleep. Upon returning to the Anyuan estate, they met with Prince Wei, Count Jinggan, and the rest, who were waiting for them in the parlor of the outer court. He Changdi first carried Chu Lian into a side room of the outer court and settled her in before hurriedly going out to meet their worried senior family members. Countess Jinggan personally went to the side room to look at Chu Lian, as well as to watch great Dr. Miao take her pulse. After the report of a clean bill of health, she could let her worries go and return to the estate with Count Jinggan. He Changdi had to endure a good round of scolding from Prince Wei before he could finally send the prince off. Standing at the main entrance of the Anyuan estate, He Changdi's back was ramrod straight, calling to mind the image of a tall mountain. His hands were placed behind his back as he watched Prince Wei's carriage disappear into the distance. A spark of realization and ruthlessness flashed across his narrow eyes. All the secrets he hadn't been able to find out even till his death had now surfaced. So that wicked woman who had caused his downfall in his past life had actually had another identity. No wonder Prince Wei cared so much for Lianer. Unfortunately, in this lifetime, Chu Lian would only belong to him. She would only ever be his wife. As Prince Wei's carriage continued making its way off into the distance, He Changdi abruptly turned around and returned to his estate with a cold expression on his face. Following right behind him was Laiwe, who didn't understand how his master could change his expression so quickly. He Changdi watched as Chu Lian drank a bowl of calming soup and fell right asleep. He sat by her bedside for a while before leaving the side room. Before he left, he ordered Wenqing and Wanlan to take good care of his wife. The moment he stepped out of the room, Laiwe came to report. "Master, The prisoner has been sent over by Captain Gua. She is in the jail right now. Would you like to head over? Changdi glanced at Laiwe once before quickly striding towards the jail. Laiwe had to break into a jog to keep up. In a remote corner of the Anyuan estate, there was a small jail. It was located in the basement of one of the unused courtyards. Normally, Changdi would conduct any unsavory business here. Chu Lian didn't even know that there was such a dark and hidden place in their estate. Changdi quickly entered the jail. There were guards on duty both inside and outside the jail. Even a fly wouldn't be able to enter without alerting them. The person managing the jail was one of the He family's private soldiers. When Changdi and Laiwe entered, only Xiao Hongyu was inside. Xiao Hongyu heard the sound of their footsteps and turned to meet them. Brother He, the prisoner is in the cell within. Brother Gua and Brother Zhang had some business, so they left first. Changdi nodded. Hongyu, I've troubled you today. You should head back earlier to rest. Xiao Hongyu rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. Brother He, what are you saying? This is all within my duties. After sending away Xiao Hongyu, Changdi turned and walked towards the jail cell inside. The jail cell was dark and damp, and the air was filled with the smell of blood and mold mixed together. It wasn't a very pleasant place to be. Chapter 695. We Are the Same, 1. One of the guards following behind Changdi moved forward to open the iron cell door before stepping aside respectfully. The expressionless Changdi strode into the jail cell, where only a single lantern was lighting the dark interior. His line of sight landed in the corner of that narrow and damp cell, where a human figure was cowering. That arrow Changdi had shot hadn't taken Muxiang's life. It had only pierced through her right shoulder blade and crippled one of her arms. He still had plenty of questions for her. How could he let her die such an easy death? Perhaps the prisoner had heard the screeching of the cell doors as they opened. The trembling Muxiang lifted up her head, showing her wretched appearance. Her gaze went out of focus for a moment, but she could slowly make out the tall figure standing in front of the cell doors. That familiar face looked exactly the same as in her memories. However, his expression had changed. The high fever that had set in from the wound made her mind a little fuzzy. Muxiang thought that she was hallucinating, so she shook her head and turned to look again, only to realize that Changdi hadn't disappeared. The sudden and pleasant surprise gave her the urge to jump up and run over to hug him. This man before her was her husband, the one who had always treated her warmly and kindly, and had always forgiven her actions. She regretted so much that she had betrayed him and chosen to be with that venomous man instead. Had he finally come back to look for her? However, even before she could attempt to hug him, a twinge of pain came from her right shoulder and arm, and a stream of memories ruthlessly doused her burgeoning hopes. The intense pain of the arrow piercing through her bones and flesh, as well as that hateful, cold look in his eyes as he had shot her. The hope in Muxiang's eyes shifted to fear and despair. She shrunk back into her body and paddled backwards, as if trying to hide in the corner of the cell. Muxiang's fearful reaction triggered a change in Changdi's expression. He smiled. However, that smile didn't even reach his eyes. He strode a few steps closer towards Muxiang. Muxiang abruptly covered her head and shouted in alarm, Don't come near me. Changdi sneered. Why would I listen to you? Your life is in my hands now. Muxiang stared with wide eyes at the man before as her fear washed over her entire body. Overwhelmed by the feelings, she grew ever calmer instead. She continued watching Changdi with frightened eyes. This person before had the same as he had in her past life, but she just couldn't put the image of their faces together. It wasn't until now that she wholeheartedly felt how foolish she had been since reincarnating into this life. After reincarnating once again, why had she continued chasing after a man? Wasn't her lesson from the past life enough warning? The only person she could count on was herself. Anyone who blocked her way should be slaughtered. Muxiang became colder and calmer. The gears in her head turned swiftly. She seemed to have woken up from the haze obscuring her mind, and she finally saw a way through the darkness. The look in her eyes became sharper. As she faced the cold man before her, she quickly tried to think of a solution. She clutched her own clothes with her uninjured hand and pretended to beg for mercy. Master, this servant was threatened by someone else. Master, please, on account for my long years of service for the matriarch, please spare this servant's life. As long as she could escape from Changde's hands, she could leave the capital and leave a life of freedom, unfettered by anyone. Whatever Xiaobojian and Changde owed her, she would take it back somehow in spades. Changde snorted contemptuously. Did you think I was blind? Muxiang's pupils dilated. She now knew that feigning weakness wasn't going to work with Changde. Yet again, she was filled with regrets. Why hadn't she realized earlier that he had already changed from the cheerful and optimistic Changde of her past life? That he had become someone dark and cunning instead? Mu Xiang lowered her head, racking her mind to think of a way out. However, she didn't expect that Changde's next words would cause her to fall into despair. Give it up. You're destined to die today here in this jail. I'll end you personally with these hands. Changde's voice was abnormally calm, yet it carried a sense of cold with them, piercing into her bones and making her shake. Mu Xiang raised her head to look at him in disbelief. The rage and defiance she had managed to suppress came roaring back like an inferno. She wasn't willing to call it quits yet, and she tried and tried again to think of an idea. However, she soon came to realize that she really had no way to escape from here. Mu Xiang let go of her last hopes and turned into a trapped animal, desperate to harm Changde by any means possible since she was going to die. Suddenly, Mu Xiang laughed neurotically. She bowed her head, her hair falling messily around her, making her look like a lunatic who had lost her mind. Changde, since you won't let me live, don't think that I'll let you continue living happily alone. Do you know who I am? Do you know who the person who shares your bed is? Changde looked down coolly at Mu Xiang with his full height. That icy expression made it clear that he thought he was simply watching a joke. That disdainful gaze provoked Mu Xiang into exploding with fury. Her sharp screech echoed in that dark and damp jail cell, like a demon who had crawled up from the depths of hell. Changde, let me tell you, in the real sixth miss of housing, that woman you call your wife is just a freak, a monster. If Mu Xiang hadn't personally experienced reincarnation, she wouldn't have believed in the supernatural or mystical. The Great Wu viewed supernatural beings like ghosts or the gods with a mix of reverence and fear. Once Changde confirmed that her words were true, then the relationship between Changde and Chulian would be broken up at the very least. In the worst-case scenario, the freak might even be dragged out to be burned to death. Chapter 696. We Are the Same. 2. Mu Xiang was waiting for Changde's calm expression to crack. However, after a long pause, nothing changed in that coolly handsome face, not even the slightest ripple. She spoke with some hesitation. You don't believe me? Following that, she listed a few examples to prove that Chu Lian wasn't the original owner of her body. Just as her panicked fit was getting more and more intense, Changde abruptly barked in laughter. If you say my wife is a freak, then what am I? And what would you be? Since you've come to this now, you probably didn't have a good end in your past life either. Changde's revelation was like a bomb to Mu Xiang. She stared with widened eyes of disbelief at Changde. What did he say? He was like her? He had reincarnated? What kind of joke was that? How could things have happened this way? Mu Xiang was about to collapse from the weight of Changde's words. She had thought that she could start afresh from the beginning, but it seemed like it had only been wishful thinking. Everything she had done now looked laughable in comparison. Numbness overtook her. The two people who had been a couple in their past lives now stood facing each other as sworn enemies in this jail cell. There wasn't any joy in Changde's heart. He simply wanted this annoying grudge to come to an end sooner, so he could return to Chu Lian's side and enjoy the warmth that belonged to him alone. After a long period of silence, Mu Xiang suddenly spoke up numbly. Changde, let me go. I'll tell you a secret. Changde wanted to laugh. Even at this moment, she actually hadn't given up. It seemed like she really wouldn't repent until the very end. What secret? That you're Lu Luan's illegitimate daughter? I'm sure that you must have passed this news on in secret to Xiao Bojian a long time ago. Lu Luan was the emperor's true name. He Changdi had sensed that there was something off about the emperor's attitude towards him, and how Xiao Bojian had purposely tried to get closer to Chu Lian. It was only with that extra relationship between Chu Lian and the emperor that it could all be explained. Muxiang's eyes were already as wide as they could go. She had never thought that He Changdi would already know of that secret. In her past life, she had only found that out right before her death. Furthermore, she had dug it out from the inheritance that her mother had left for her. By then, He Changdi had already passed away in her past life. Finally, the despair that had been building up overwhelmed Mu Xiang. After 15 minutes, He Changdi stepped out of the jail cell. Lai Yue was guarding the door. When the manservant saw that He Changdi's right hand was stained with blood, he could guess what had happened to the prisoner inside. He Changdi paused in his steps and instructed him, "Take the corpse away and burn it yourself." Lai Yue took a group of guards into the jail cell. They were greeted by the sight of the prisoner lying in the corner of the dark cell, a dagger stabbed through her chest and a grudgeful expression on her face. However, she was no longer breathing. When He Changdi stepped out into the little courtyard outside the jail, he looked up to the dusk sky slowly giving way to the dark of night. Waves of emotions were causing ripples in the depths of his eyes. He stood with his hands behind his back. Now that he had personally gotten rid of his sworn enemy from his past life, there wasn't as much as satisfaction as he had expected in his heart. Conversely, it felt like his heart had become even more desolate and bleak. He turned towards the direction of Songtao Court, and the desire rising in his heart was the straw that broke his calm facade. He hurriedly ran towards the home of his heart. When he returned to Songtao Court, the sinister air cloaked around him kept all the servants hushed in fear. They even made sure to breathe silently. He Changdi went to the bathroom first to take a bath and change out of his clothes, washing away the bloody aura around him. When he changed into casual home clothes, he returned to Chu Lian's side. Chu Lian was still in the midst of slumber when she felt that her body was encased in a familiar warmth. When He Hongdi lifted her head a little to slide his arm under her neck, her body actually turned subconsciously to accommodate the movement, perhaps out of trained habit. That small movement immediately dispersed the gloominess in He Changdi's heart. He pulled his lovely wife closer and pressed his firm chest against Chu Lian's slender back, covering her entirely with his body, as if this was the only way he could only chase away the uneasy emptiness in his heart. He Changdi followed the curve of Chu Lian's shoulder down, his hand tracing down her smooth skin until he found her tiny little hand. He took her hand into his own and entwined their fingers. Finally, he stroked her belly gently. He Sanlang breathed in his wife's comfortingly familiar scent, then bent to kiss the top of her head. He tucked the thin blankets properly around Chu Lian before finally falling asleep next to her. Thanks to the resolution of the grudge he had borne for most of his life, He Changdi's slumber on this night was particularly deep and relaxed. When he opened his eyes again, Chu Lian had already woken up. She was still lying in his embrace as she peeked at his face. He Changdi's first reaction was a startled silence, before his expression softened. He reached out to stroke his wife's tender cheek and asked with his sleep-roughened voice, "What's wrong?" It was rare for his lazy little piggy to wake up even earlier than him. While He Changdi had been sleeping, Chu Lian had been watching him and going through many thoughts in her mind. All the strange little things that He Changdi had done ever since she had come to the Great Wu would make sense if he had already lived through everything once and reincarnated back to this moment. The corners of Chu Lian's mouth lifted, and she showed a sweet and trusting smile to him. She actually knew that He Changdi must definitely have gone to see Mu Xiang during the time she was resting. With her lunatic husband's skill, there wasn't a way for Mu Xiang to keep anything a secret. Although she hadn't said it outright, he likely already knew all about the truth. She could also feel that their relationship hadn't been threatened by this revelation, and that their appreciation and trust for each other had instead grown. "Isn't there something you want to ask me about?" Chu Lian reached out in a similar action and stroked the side of his face with her thumb. He Sanlang stiffened up slightly, before the smile on his face became a touch more genuine. He couldn't resist stealing a kiss from Chu Lian's pink lips. He returned the question to her. "Isn't there something you want to ask me about too?" After he finished speaking, the two of them laughed in unison. He Changdi pulled Chu Lian closer to him and hugged her tight, while Chu Lian wrapped her arms around his narrow waist. Chapter 697, Hidden Tempest 1. As for what they had experienced before, and who they had been in the past, those didn't matter anymore. The most important thing was that they were now married to each other, and they would be together from now on, and even blessed with the crystallization of their love. Chu Lian didn't care about what He Changdi had done to Mu Xiang. Ever since she had heard from him personally about the end he had come to in his past life, the end that she hadn't read about in the novel, she felt like she could empathize with him more. As much as He Changdi looked like a vicious and merciless person who solved things with force in other people's eyes, in her heart, he was the best husband she could ever have. After August had passed and the autumn winds were blowing, Second Prince was finally stripped of his title and thrown into the imperial jail. Consort Liang was also banished into the cold palace, where disgraced concubines languished for a short time till their deaths. Despite these misfortunes, Prince Jean never spoke a single word to help lift the blame from Second Prince and Consort Liang. Before Consort Liang had hanged herself in the cold palace, she had met with Prince Jean one last time. Only then did she find out that Prince Jean already knew the truth behind how she had killed Consort Xian. Following closely after the news that the successor to the throne had been deposed, rumors spread of the emperor being in ill health. The fight for the throne in court became even more intense. The battles that were being fought in secret had now shifted to the open. In court, it was Fourth Prince and Sixth Prince whose factions were the largest. Chu Lian's pregnancy had already progressed to its 7th month. She and He Changdi had already decided together that she would not leave the estate until the little fellow in her belly was born. For some reason, Sima Hui had already taken her troops with her back to Shandong at the end of August. Chu Lian's usual guests at the Anyuan estate were Royal Princess Duanjia, Lady Yang, Old Duchess Zheng, and other nobility in her circle. Finally, when it was mid-September, it had come time for House Ying's 8th Miss Chu Yuan to marry Royal Prince Shou. Their match had been made by the emperor himself, so they were preparing a grand celebration of it. Even though she had received House Ying's red invitation to the wedding, Chu Lian didn't attend. She only stayed at home and rested. When evening fell and it was about time for dinner, Royal Princess Duanjia came running over excitedly. Chu Lian watched in stunned amazement as Royal Princess Duanjia came up to her in blaze, took up the cup of fruit tea she had just drunk from, and downed it in one gulp. "Princess?" Royal Princess Duanjia sat right down next to Chu Lian after drinking her tea. She hugged one of Chu Lian's arms with sparkling eyes as she said, "Ha ha ha." Royal Princess Duanjia nodded. Right now, the men from the Ying estate and Prince Yangkang's estate are all looking for Chu Yuan, but they haven't found her yet. Then what's going to happen now? Since the bride had been switched, and it had been an engagement bestowed by the emperor, this was no small matter. If the emperor decided to punish them, the entire Ying estate would likely suffer. Royal Princess Duanjia harumphed. Of course Imperial Uncle is going to punish them. However, there is something weird about all of this. When Uncle Yongkong was going to bring the matter up with the emperor, Cousin Shou stopped him. Judging from the way he was acting, it seems like he already knew your 5th sister long ago. Everyone's thinking there was something up with that. Chapter 698, Hidden Tempest 2. Chu Lian found it strange as well. The original novel hadn't mentioned much of Miss Su. Over the few times they had interacted, Chu Lian understood that Miss Su wasn't an innocent and naive young lady. Perhaps this was what she had chosen for herself. As for how Miss Yuan had struck an agreement with her, Chu Lian didn't want to know. She had nothing to do with housing now anyway. It was better for her to keep a peaceful mind and wait for the birth of her child in her own estate. When Royal Princess Duanjia saw how calm Chu Lian was acting, she gaped a little. "Chu Lu, Aren't you curious at all about this? Chu Lian poured a new cup of honey water for herself before answering. You know what my relationship with housing is like. I don't want to pay attention to whether they're doing fine or not. Royal Princess Duanjia set down the cake in her hands and shifted closer to Chu Lian. It's good that you've already drawn the lines between you and Hao Xing. That father of yours isn't someone good anyway. Chu Lian thought to herself. She was a transmigrated soul. Her father wasn't in this world at all. Royal Princess Duanjia stayed until He Changdi returned, upon which she was chased away. It was getting harder for Chu Lian to move around, so she had senior servant Zhong send Royal Princess Duanjia away in place of her. He Changdi walked up to Chu Lian. With a smooth and practiced movement, he slid one arm under her back and another under her knees. He then lifted her up from the chaise and brought her into their bedroom. Chu Lian had a little blush on her face. She patted He Changdi's solid chest. I'm a little heavy now. He Sanlang looked down at his blushing wife. Although his face was still stuck in its stiff expression, the look in his eyes was as warm and gentle as could be. He bent down to kiss her soft lips before speaking in husky tones. I don't mind. Chu Lian was set down in a sitting position on the bed. He Changdi grabbed a thin blanket from the side and covered her with it. He sat by the bed, an arm slung around Chu Lian's shoulders as he pulled her to lean on his chest. Chu Lian raised her chin slightly to look at him. She noticed the stubble on his chin and the dark circles under his eyes. She touched his slightly prickly chin and asked, Did you just get back? He Changdi nodded. The situation at court is becoming more worrying. I can't leave it alone for long. I took some time to visit Prince Yangkang's estate in the afternoon. Since Royal Princess Duanjia came by, I suppose you already know all about what happened? Although Chu Lian no longer kept contact with Hao Xing, from an outsider's perspective, Chu Lian was one of Hao Xing's ladies. He Changdi had gone to Prince Yangkang's estate in place of her to give their congratulations to the new couple and to prevent any loose tongues from wagging. Chu Lian nodded. How is fifth sister? Aren't you afraid that it'll change my mind and refuse to tell you anything? Xiao Bojian suddenly let out a sinister smile. The gap between the darkness in his eyes and his ethereal features made the woman drunk on his beauty. Are you really not going to tell me, madam? The woman looked his body up and down with a seductive gaze and caught hold of his face. I can't bear not to tell you, thanks to this face of yours. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.